I had been driving all day, the long stretch of road cutting through dense forest on both sides. The air outside was cold, sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine. I was tired, my eyes burning from squinting through the late afternoon sun, but I needed to reach the cabin before nightfall. It wasn't far from the main road, just a small dirt track leading into a cluster of trees, but the directions were vague. I kept telling myself it would be worth it. Peaceful, alone, no one around for miles. I had rented the place for a week to disconnect, to escape the constant hum of city life. The first thing I noticed when I finally arrived was how quiet it was. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional bird calling, which felt eerie in the deepening shadows. The cabin itself was small, made of dark wood that had weathered over the years. It looked solid, though old, with a chimney and a small porch covered in moss. I parked my car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the silence. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and damp air hit me immediately. Dust covered the corners of the room, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been used in months. There was a small kitchen area, a living space with a worn-out couch, and a loft that served as the bedroom. I put down my bag and started to unpack, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me. The first night was restless. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence. A branch scraping against the side of the cabin made me jump more than once. I kept checking the locks on the doors, the old bolts creaking in protest as I slid them back and forth. I told myself it was just the wind, that nothing could get in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The next morning, I went for a walk around the area, trying to familiarize myself with the land. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for miles. The trees were tall, blocking most of the sunlight and making the forest floor dark even at midday. I found a small creek nearby, its water clear and cold. I felt a little relief being outside, the fresh air clearing some of the tension from the night. But as I walked, I noticed signs that something had been moving through the woods. Footprints, broken branches, areas where the underbrush had been disturbed. They weren't fresh, but they were too organized to be random. Back at the cabin, I tried to distract myself. I cleaned up, cooked a small meal, and read a book. But every time I heard a sound outside, a snap, a rustle, a distant shout that could have been the wind, I felt my heart jump. I kept the door locked, the windows closed tightly, and a heavy stick by the door just in case. On the third night, the tension became unbearable. I had been hearing noises almost constantly. Footsteps on the porch, scratching at the walls, faint thuds from the loft above. I convinced myself it was the house settling, or perhaps an animal. But when I got up to check, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My hands trembled as I pushed it closed, checking the locks again, tightening them as best I could. Sleep didn't come. I lay on the couch, flashlight on, ears straining for any sound. At some point, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, and it wasn't mine. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the stick and crept through the cabin, checking every corner. The loft stairs creaked under my weight, each step making me flinch. When I reached the top, nothing was there, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something had just moved. I couldn't stay in the loft. I went back down, sat in the living room, and waited for the night to end. By the fourth day, I realized I couldn't go on like this. Every movement, every sound made me jump. I decided to leave the cabin for a while, to hike down to the main road and get some contact with the outside world. I packed a small bag, took my flashlight and a few essentials, and set out into the forest. The trees seemed taller now, more oppressive, their shadows stretching unnaturally. The trail was rough, overgrown in parts, and I constantly felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The hike took hours, longer than I expected. I found the main road, a thin strip of asphalt that cut through the forest like a scar. Relief flooded me when I saw a car in the distance, and I waved, hoping to get a ride to town. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The car was empty. No one was inside, and the engine wasn't running. The keys were in the ignition. I didn't linger. I turned back, feeling a cold sweat on my back, and retraced my steps through the woods, moving as fast as I dared without making too much noise. When I returned to the cabin, I realized I needed to understand what was happening. I searched the perimeter carefully. There were signs of human presence. Footprints that weren't mine, small piles of broken branches as if someone had tried to hide something. It wasn't random animals. Someone had been around the cabin. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think clearly. I checked my phone, no signal. I tried to call for help. Nothing. I needed a plan. I spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture against the doors, reinforced windows with planks, and created a small safe area in the kitchen where I could retreat if necessary. I collected water from the creek and stocked enough food for a few days, just in case. Every shadow, every sound made my heart race. The isolation that I had wanted now felt like a trap. The fifth night was the worst. I was awake for hours, hearing whispers of movement outside. At some point, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the forest, just barely visible in the dim moonlight. I couldn't tell if it was human or an animal, but it stayed there, watching. I kept the lights low, barely breathing, waiting for it to leave. Hours passed, and it never moved closer. When dawn finally broke, the figure had gone. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my essentials and decided to hike out immediately, hoping to reach a place with a phone signal. I didn't take the trail I had used before. I went deeper into the forest, moving carefully but quickly, avoiding open areas. The forest seemed endless, the trees blending into one another. I felt exhaustion settle in, but I kept moving. By late afternoon, I finally reached a clearing. A small ranger station stood there, almost hidden by the trees. I ran toward it, pounding on the door until a ranger finally answered. I was shaking, covered in dirt and sweat, but relief washed over me when I saw another human face. I explained as best I could what had happened. They radioed for backup and came with me to the cabin the next day. When we returned, it became clear what had been going on. The cabin had been broken into multiple times recently. There were signs of squatters, people who had been living in the woods, moving silently, watching from a distance. No one had attacked me, but they had been close enough that if I had left the cabin at night, it could have been dangerous. The ranger showed me the footprints, the hidden caches, and the places where people had been watching from the trees. I finally left the cabin behind. The experience stayed with me, vivid and terrifying, but I knew I had survived. The week I had planned to spend alone became a lesson in awareness, in the quiet dangers that exist in isolation. I returned to the city, to noise and people and safety, but every now and then, I remember the stillness of that forest, the way the shadows moved, and the weight of being truly alone and watched. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of being alone in the woods, away from any trace of civilization, had fascinated me for a long time. The cabin I rented was remote, off a small, unmarked dirt road that twisted through thick pine and birch forests. According to the owner, it had been uninhabited for nearly a year. The last few renters had left quickly, she said, without giving much reason. That only made me more determined. I wanted the silence, the isolation, the pure absence of the everyday noise that always seemed to press on me. I needed to be alone, to feel the world narrow down to just me, the trees, and the occasional wildlife. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The directions were vague, and the GPS only got me part of the way. At some point, it stopped recognizing the road entirely. I followed the dirt track, bouncing over rocks and ruts, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the shadows of the trees grew longer and more twisted in the late afternoon light. The further I drove, the quieter it became. Not quiet in a peaceful sense, but a heavy, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to falter between the dense trunks. There were no birds singing, no rustle of squirrels in the branches, only the dull thud of my tires against the earth and the occasional snap of a branch under the car. Finally, After what felt like hours, I spotted the cabin. It was a small, rough structure, weathered gray, leaning slightly to one side. The windows were dusty, streaked with dirt, and the wood of the walls looked worn but solid. A narrow trail led from the road to the front door, overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling the weight of the air immediately. It was thick and damp, scented with wet earth and the faintly sharp smell of pine resin. There was no sound but the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. The door was locked, but a key hidden under a loose stone beside the steps fit perfectly. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a table and 2 chairs pushed against the wall, and a narrow bed with a thin mattress and faded blanket. A single lantern sat on a shelf, along with a box of matches. The floor creaked under my weight, and the air felt heavy in a way I didn't immediately understand. It wasn't just the dampness or the mold, it was the sense that the cabin hadn't been lived in properly for a long time. I set my bag down and walked around, examining the place. The kitchen area was small, a single counter, a sink with a pipe that was likely connected to a small pump well outside. The shelves were empty except for a few old cans, rusted and dented. The windows were grimy but intact, letting in a thin, gray light. Outside, the forest pressed close, the trees so thick they blocked most of the sky. I could hear a creak somewhere in the distance, but it was faint, as if muffled by the weight of the forest itself. I spent the first hour cleaning up a little, sweeping away dust, brushing the cobwebs from the corners, and lighting a fire in the stove. The warmth felt good against the chill that had settled into my bones from the drive. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I listened to the sounds of the forest. At first, I thought the silence would be comforting. Instead, it felt immense, almost physical. The wind whispered through the branches scraped against the roof, and occasionally I heard the soft, distant thud of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons or squirrels, but the way the sound came and went, deliberate and slow, put me on edge. The night fell quickly. In the forest, darkness is different from the city. There are no streetlights to soften the shadows, no distant hum of cars or air conditioners, just complete, almost tangible black. I lit the lantern, but it barely cut through the darkness, the corners of the room still deep in shadow. Outside, I could hear things moving, not just the usual rustling, but heavier, slower, deliberate movements. Branches breaking under weight that couldn't be a deer. Something walking, pacing, stopping, starting again. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or an animal. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, listening. The fire cast flickering shadows across the walls, stretching the shapes of the furniture into grotesque forms. My imagination started to run. I imagined someone standing just outside the window, watching, their eyes reflecting the lantern light. But when I went to look, there was nothing. Only trees, thick and impenetrable. The feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to stay up. Sleep seemed impossible. I kept walking around the cabin, checking the doors and windows. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. It was maddening. The mind fills in blanks, they say, but my mind felt overwhelmed, on constant alert. Every creak of the cabin, every snap in the forest made my heart jump. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The branches lashed against the cabin, and rain began to fall in long, heavy sheets. The sound was deafening on the roof. I sat in the far corner, trying to steady myself. Then I heard a sound different from the rain. A low, dragging thud outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Not something a small animal could make. My pulse raced. I wanted to look, but I froze. The sound moved along the outside of the cabin, from one side to the other. The dragging stopped at the back, and I thought I heard a faint scraping on the wood. I realized I needed to stay calm. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the shelf and shined it at the window. The rain and darkness made visibility almost zero, but I saw something. a shadow taller than a man, moving past the edge of the trees. It was too fast to be deer. My stomach turned. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were large, human-sized. I stayed in the cabin, barricading the door with the table. The rain and wind made it nearly impossible to hear anything else. Hours passed. Couldn't sleep. I tried to make noise, throwing small objects outside to see if there was a response, but nothing came. Eventually, the rain stopped and the forest went silent again. Exhaustion made my limbs heavy. I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin another night without some plan. Morning came gray and foggy. I opened the door cautiously. Nothing. The forest was silent. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been near. Just the rain-soaked earth and fallen leaves. I decided to leave immediately. The dirt road back was slippery, and the fog made it hard to see. I kept my hands on the wheel, eyes scanning constantly. Every shadow seemed alive. But after an hour, I reached a paved road, and the world felt normal again. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I thought about the shadow outside the cabin, the dragging sound, the way it moved with such purpose. I never knew if it was a person lost in the woods, some criminal hiding, or something else entirely. But I knew I would never go back to a remote cabin alone. The forest had a way of swallowing you whole, of making you doubt your own senses. And I had been lucky I had escaped. From that day, I always chose cabins closer to towns with other people nearby. I kept the memory vivid, a warning to myself. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. And in that kind of darkness, your mind and your body are tested in ways you can't anticipate. You think you are prepared, but you aren't. And sometimes, you realize what you fear most is not ghosts or fairy tales. It's real, human-sized, moving in the shadows, waiting. I had always wanted a place to escape, not just from the city or the noise or the people, but from myself. I had been living in a small apartment on the edge of town, in a building where the walls were thin enough to hear every cough, every muffled fight, every cry of loneliness from the neighbors. My life had become a rhythm of work, sleep, and the endless repetition of small disappointments, and I needed something different. I had to be alone, somewhere that felt like it belonged to no one else, where I could breathe without someone else's presence pressing on me. The idea of a cabin in the woods had always fascinated me, but I never had the time or the money to seriously consider it. Until one day, scrolling through a real estate listing at work during my lunch break, I found it. A small cabin, older, made of weathered wood, nestled in a dense forest about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, or it could be mine. The idea of waking up to nothing but trees and birds, with no neighbors and no streetlights, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. I signed the papers a week later, driving out there for the first time. The city slowly shrinking behind me, I felt a growing thrill mixed with unease. The road became a single lane of cracked asphalt, lined with trees whose branches leaned over in silent judgment. The further I went, the quieter it became, until even the hum of the car felt loud. When I finally turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, throwing long shadows across the road. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was soft and golden, giving the whole place an almost serene quality. It was smaller than I imagined, roughly the size of a 2-bedroom apartment, but it had a sturdy look, a stone chimney, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I could hear a distant creak somewhere beyond the trees. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet sink into me. The cabin's interior was simple. A main room with a small kitchen area along one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a lofted bedroom above. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and dust. I walked through slowly, imagining how it would feel to live there, to wake up to that silence every day. I unpacked the bare essentials, then sat on the floor, just listening. There was nothing. No hum of traffic, no shouting, no doors slamming. Nothing. The quiet was almost too much. I felt a little hollow at first, But over the next hour, the quiet became a presence of its own, a rhythm that I could follow like a pulse. The first night, I slept fitfully, but it was the best sleep I had had in months. No alarms, no sirens, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant crash of water. Morning came slowly, with sunlight slipping through the small windows, cutting golden rectangles across the floor. I brewed coffee on the small stove, stepping outside to take in the forest, the creek sparkling in the sunlight, birds moving in flitting shadows between the trees. I felt light, untethered, almost as if I had peeled away layers of the city that had weighed me down. For a week, I stayed in that cabin, walking in the surrounding woods, chopping small pieces of wood for the stove, cooking simple meals, and slowly letting myself become attuned to the rhythms of nature. I didn't even feel lonely. In fact, I had started to crave the solitude, the way it allowed me to hear the world in its quietest moments. But the first time I noticed that something wasn't quite right, I had no name for it. It was subtle at first. A movement in the trees that didn't make sense, a branch snapping when I was certain I was alone. One evening, as I returned from the creek, I saw footprints in the dirt, near the back of the cabin. They were fresh, human, adult-sized, and walking toward the woods. My heart started pounding, and I scanned the area, but saw nothing. No one. I told myself it was probably hunters or hikers passing by. There were signs along the road warning about hunters in the area. Still, the unease stayed with me. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was normal. I brushed it off, going to sleep with the window cracked open to let in the cool night air. The next few days, the feeling grew. At first, it was just noises. Footsteps outside when I was inside, a branch tapping against the window late at night, the sound of someone moving in the undergrowth. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, small creatures, the wind, but the sounds didn't match what animals could make. And the footprints appeared again, closer to the cabin each time. One morning, I found them leading up to the porch and then into the woods. Whoever it was hadn't touched the door or the windows. They hadn't needed to. I began sleeping with the doors locked and a baseball bat next to the bed. I installed extra locks on the windows. I started carrying a small flashlight whenever I went outside after dark, even if it was just to go to the outhouse a few steps away. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My nerves became frayed. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I began checking the perimeter of the cabin during the day, circling the building, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. I saw none. Then it happened. I woke up one night to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My heart pounded. I crept out of the loft, gripping the baseball bat tightly, and peered through the window. The porch was empty. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft scraping against the wood near the door. Someone was there outside. I stayed frozen, trying to convince myself it was a branch caught in the wind. But then I heard breathing, steady, deliberate, right outside the door. I didn't call the police immediately. I didn't know how. I was hours from the nearest town. No cell service. The nearest neighbors were miles away. I did the only thing I could. I stayed awake all night, listening. The noises stopped at dawn. I forced myself to eat breakfast, though I could barely swallow. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin, nailing boards over some windows, even checking the chimney to make sure someone couldn't climb down inside. Still, every sound made me jump. Over the next few days, I began to notice small signs that someone had been there when I wasn't looking. A branch moved in a way it shouldn't. A footprint in the dirt near the creek that hadn't been there before. The back of the cabin had small scratches, as if someone had tested the walls, checking for weaknesses. Every night I heard footsteps on the porch, sometimes at odd hours, sometimes lingering for hours before disappearing. I didn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time. I started carrying a small knife in my pocket when I went outside. Eventually, I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, my mind racing with fear. I started leaving small traps, simple things, tripwires tied to cans, a makeshift alarm of sorts. I set up cameras I could monitor during the day. I even began leaving a flashlight on the porch, aimed toward the woods, as if I were expecting someone to come. The fear was almost unbearable. I knew someone was out there watching, waiting. I didn't know why. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to survive. It escalated one night. I was asleep when I heard a loud crash outside, followed by running footsteps. The noise was chaotic, violent. I grabbed my bat and ran outside, but the moon was behind clouds, and the forest was black. I shouted, hoping to scare whoever it was. The footsteps vanished. I spent the rest of the night circling the cabin, shining the flashlight into every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. The next morning, I found evidence of forced entry. Someone had tried to pry the door open, leaving deep gouges in the wood. There were more footprints. They led into the woods and then stopped. I realized then that this wasn't going to stop unless I acted. I spent the next day driving into town, buying supplies, telling a local sheriff what had happened. He was skeptical at first, but agreed to drive out with me the next day to inspect the cabin. We arrived in daylight. I showed him the marks, the footprints, the damage. He spent hours inspecting the area. By the end, he nodded grimly and said someone had definitely been there, possibly camping nearby, hiding in the woods, watching me. He offered to patrol the area and promised to leave extra deputies in the forest on occasion, but I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. I realized I couldn't live there, not yet, not while someone was out there. I decided to leave. I packed my things carefully, taking only what I needed, leaving the cabin intact but empty. I made sure to remove any trace of my presence, covering footprints, dismantling traps, wiping the porch clean. The drive back to the city was tense. Every rustle of the trees outside the road, every shadow across the windshield made me flinch. But eventually, I made it. Weeks later, I drove past the dirt road again, curiosity pushing me forward. The cabin was still there, empty, quiet, peaceful looking, in a way that made my stomach twist. I had always thought I knew the forest, even before I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the mountains. I had hiked these trails before, though never this far into the northern part where cell service disappeared entirely, where the roads became nothing more than beaten paths with puddles and mud. The cabin had been rented through a small listing on a website that promised isolation, quiet, and the chance to get away from the constant noise of city life. That last part had appealed to me. I needed silence, and I thought a week alone in a remote cabin would give me exactly that. The first day, arriving, was deceptively calm. The drive up the winding mountain road had been long and tense. My car had barely managed the last mile, skidding over loose gravel and stones, making me wonder if I would even reach the place in one piece. But there it was, a modest wooden cabin tucked into a clearing. It looked old but sturdy, the kind of structure that had probably seen decades of winters and storms. The smell of pine and damp earth was heavy in the air. There was a small porch with a wooden railing and 2 rocking chairs, though they were weathered and covered in bird droppings. The windows were dusty, but I could see through them well enough to catch glimpses of the sparse interior. A simple kitchen, a table, and a wood-burning stove. I unpacked slowly, leaving the essentials in the corner near the door. Food, water, a first aid kit, a small heater, and a pile of firewood I'd brought from town. I thought about starting a fire immediately, but the sun was still high, and I wanted to explore the surroundings before darkness fell. The first few hours were uneventful. I walked around the clearing, noticing how the trees grew thick and close as I moved farther away from the cabin. Pine needles carpeted the ground, soft but treacherous when stepping over roots. Birds called intermittently, but otherwise, the forest felt silent in a way that made me hyper-aware of every movement and sound. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin to prepare dinner. I chopped vegetables on the small counter and boiled water for pasta, all the while glancing out the window at the shadows creeping between the trees. I felt a sense of unease, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being so alone. As night fell, I built a small fire in the stove. The cabin groaned and creaked as the wind picked up outside. It rattled the windows and shook the old door slightly. I sat close to the fire, reading a book I had brought, but my attention kept drifting to the sound of the wind. There were occasional thumps outside, which I told myself were just branches breaking under their own weight, though I found myself standing up multiple times to check the windows. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. Every sound, every snap of a twig, rustle of leaves, made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my stomach knot. It was a dragging sound, slow, deliberate, and coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, straining to hear. It stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering. My rational mind told me it was probably a deer or some other large animal, but the rhythm of the noise didn't match anything I had ever heard in the forest. It sounded like something heavy being pulled along the ground. I didn't move until dawn, and by morning the dragging sound was gone, leaving only a vague sense of unease. I chalked it up to imagination, fatigue, and the unfamiliarity of being alone in the forest. I spent the next day exploring further, walking along the small stream I had noticed the previous afternoon. The water was clear, and the rocks were slick, making footing tricky. I kept an eye on the surroundings, trying to spot wildlife, but I saw nothing unusual beyond the occasional bird or squirrel. I collected some water in a portable bottle, filled my backpack with supplies, and returned to the cabin in the early evening. That evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Footprints in the muddy patch near the back of the cabin. They were too large to be human, and they didn't resemble any animal prints I recognized. My stomach tightened. I examined them carefully, but there was no pattern of a run or sprint, just a slow, deliberate movement, dragging slightly, as if the creature had been carrying something. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Maybe, but the prints didn't match any bear tracks I had studied before. A human? Perhaps, though I couldn't explain the dragging motion. I cleaned the floor, tried to shake off the worry, and told myself I was overthinking. Night fell again, heavier and darker than before. I built a stronger fire, pushing the logs together so the flames licked the walls, hoping the warmth and light would comfort me. But as I lay down on the floor mattress, the dragging sound returned. It was outside, circling the cabin, slow and steady. I could hear the crunch of debris, the scrape of something heavy on dirt and stone. My first instinct was to hide, but I knew hiding wouldn't help. The cabin had only one door and 2 windows, all easily accessible. I grabbed the kitchen knife, feeling its weight in my hand, and sat near the door, listening. Hours passed with that sound moving around me, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I couldn't see anything through the darkness outside. My mind raced through survival strategies. I thought about climbing to the roof, barricading myself, or even trying to drive my car if necessary, though the road was treacherous and I doubted I could reach it in the dark without making noise. Exhaustion overtook me briefly, and I fell into a fitful sleep, waking several times to the dragging and rustling outside. Morning brought no relief. I cautiously stepped outside, armed with the knife. The forest was quiet again, but the ground told a story. There were more prints now, circling the cabin, and something had scraped along the siding of the structure. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had been outside wasn't leaving. I decided to move quickly and systematically. First, I checked the perimeter of the clearing, marking the footprints with sticks and rocks to see the pattern. They went around the cabin in irregular loops, never straying too far. I realized I had to leave, but the mountain road was muddy and treacherous. My car was barely functional on the incline, and the forest around me was thick. I spent the day preparing, gathering enough food and water for several hours in case I got stuck. I carried extra logs to the porch to create a makeshift barrier, hoping to slow anyone or anything approaching. As the sun began to set, I was ready. I took a deep breath and stepped into the trees, following the path I had come in on. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. My eyes darted around constantly, and I kept my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, and the fading light made navigation difficult. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see the dragging figure, but there was nothing visible. My muscles ached from tension and carrying supplies, and my mind started to play tricks on me. Shadows moved where there were none, and sounds echoed in unnatural ways. I focused on staying calm, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, following the faint tire tracks I had noticed the day before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the mountain road. My car was still there, half covered in mud and leaves. Relief washed over me, though I remained vigilant, scanning the surrounding forest. I jumped in, started the engine, and cautiously made my way down the winding road. Every mile felt like a mile closer to safety, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the time I reached the main road and proper civilization, I was covered in sweat, dirt, and scratches from branches. I parked at the first gas station, trembling, and called the local ranger station. They took my report seriously, though when they investigated the area later, they found nothing conclusive. No human prints, no animal prints beyond the usual wildlife, only vague disturbances in the soil and debris. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. I couldn't explain what had circled the cabin, dragging something along the ground. But I did know one thing: I would never, ever return. I had learned that some places, no matter how picturesque, hold a danger that cannot be reasoned with, that waits patiently and silently, testing those who dare to intrude. And I had survived, not because of luck alone, but because I had stayed alert, moved carefully, and never let panic take control. The cabin remains in my memory with vivid clarity. The creaking of the wood under the wind, the oppressive darkness outside the windows, the dragging sound that kept me awake for hours, and the realization that the forest, beautiful as it may be, can be merciless. I learned how fragile safety can be in the wilderness, how a single week can feel like months when you are truly alone and confronted with the unknown. I carry that lesson with me now every time I walk into the woods, even the small patches of forest near my home, and I am always more cautious, always aware, never assuming that quiet or isolation means safety. In the end, I returned to the city to warmth, light. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I stumbled across the cabin in the online listing. It was described as remote, off the grid, a place where the chaos of the city could be left far behind. The pictures were beautiful. A small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, nestled among dense pine trees, a lake just a few hundred meters away. I had wanted this for myself. A week alone, away from screens, phones, and responsibilities. I liked the idea of complete silence, a chance to be entirely alone. I had driven hours to get there, taking a winding mountain road that gradually narrowed into gravel before fading into a dirt track overgrown with weeds. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, throwing long shadows through the trees and turning the lake into a sheet of gold and fire. The cabin itself was smaller than I had imagined, but sturdier, with a porch that creaked under my weight and windows clouded with dust. I parked the car and climbed the steps, feeling the unfamiliar tension of being somewhere I had never been. The air smelled sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was rustic, nothing fancy, but it had the essentials. A small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table, chairs, and a single bedroom. There was a fireplace with a stack of logs, and the smell of old wood and faint mildew hung in the corners. I dropped my bags and began unpacking. The first night was strange but peaceful. I lit the stove, feeling the warmth spread slowly through the cabin. Outside, I could hear the faint rustle of animals in the underbrush and the distant lap of the lake against the shore. I stayed awake longer than usual, sitting on the porch with a thermos of tea, staring at the dark woods that surrounded me. Everything was quiet in a way I wasn't used to, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every tiny sound, from the creak of a branch to the soft scuttle of a small creature through the undergrowth. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There were walking trails, though they were overgrown, almost as if nature had reclaimed them. The lake was colder than it looked, and the rocks at the edge were slippery. I spent hours walking along the shore, collecting stones, examining insects, listening to the water. I kept the cabin in sight, but I noticed how quickly the landscape changed as I moved. Trees loomed differently, shadows deepened, and the wind seemed to carry different sounds. That night, I cooked on the stove, careful to maintain a fire in the fireplace. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though I was alone. The thought of some stranger wandering these woods seemed absurd, but I couldn't shake a lingering unease. On the third day, things began to shift. It started subtly, the feeling of being watched, even though I knew I was alone. I would glance out of the cabin window and swear I saw something move in the distance, between the trees, but when I focused, there was nothing. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I decided to go for a longer walk, deeper into the forest, hoping the physical exertion would distract me. I had a map and a compass, and I thought I knew the area well enough. Hours passed, and I found myself in a section of the woods that didn't resemble anything near the cabin. The trees were older, the underbrush thicker, and the light dimmer. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I felt my pulse quicken. I checked the map. Yes, I was off the marked trails, but only slightly. I turned to head back, but the paths seemed to shift in ways that didn't make sense. A trail that I was sure led north now appeared to curve east. My anxiety began to rise. I kept walking, telling myself the cabin was nearby. I didn't have a phone signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. Night fell faster than I expected. I found a small clearing and decided to set up a temporary camp for the night. I gathered some dry wood and tried to start a fire. It took longer than I thought, and by the time the flames caught, the darkness had enveloped everything beyond the circle of firelight. The woods felt alive with noises I had not noticed during the day. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, the crack of branches. Every sound made me tense, my mind imagining threats that weren't there. I stayed awake most of the night, shivering despite the fire, listening to the forest and willing the sun to rise. The next morning, I managed to find a faint trail that led back in the general direction of the cabin. It took hours, and I was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in scratches from thorns and branches. When I finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. I stumbled inside, locked the door behind me, and sank onto the floor. I realized I had underestimated the isolation and the forest's disorienting nature. The sense of vulnerability was intense. I was reminded that in these woods, I was utterly alone. After that, I became much more careful. I rationed food and water, kept the cabin secure, and only ventured out during daylight. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I began noticing small things that unsettled me. The firewood stacked slightly differently than I had left it, footprints in the dirt near the cabin, the sound of something heavy moving in the woods. I told myself it could be deer or raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't natural. I double-checked the locks every night, kept knives and tools within reach, and avoided wandering far from the cabin. One afternoon, I went down to the lake to collect water. The sky was overcast, and the light had a gray, cold tone. I filled my jugs and started back when I noticed a figure in the trees. Not clearly human, but too large and upright to be an animal. My heart froze. I froze, holding my breath, watching. The figure didn't move toward me, just stood, partially hidden by the brush. I decided not to approach and took a longer, indirect route back. I didn't sleep well that night. The tension escalated over the next 2 days. I began hearing footsteps on the porch at night, soft but deliberate. I kept the doors locked, and nothing was ever visible through the windows. I considered leaving immediately, but the dirt road had been washed out by rain, and my car was blocked by fallen branches. I was trapped until I could clear the road or until someone came searching for me. I rationed my food even more strictly and stayed alert, scanning the woods from the windows. The following morning, I decided I had to make my way to the main road, regardless of the risk. I packed essential supplies, grabbed a sturdy backpack, and left at first light. I moved quietly, keeping low and avoiding obvious paths that someone might watch. Hours into the trek, I found signs that someone had been in the woods recently. Trash, footprints, and cut marks on trees that looked deliberate. Fear surged, but I pressed on, constantly checking behind me. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that gave me a view of the main road below. Relief flooded me. I could see a car passing in the distance. I hurried down, keeping to the undergrowth. When I finally reached the road, I ran, waving my arms until the driver stopped. I explained briefly, mostly through gestures, that I needed help. The driver gave me a lift to a nearby town. I reported the situation to the authorities, who later came to check the cabin. They found evidence that someone had been living in the woods nearby, watching the cabin, but the individual had left before they arrived. They assured me it was likely a transient who used remote areas to hide, and that my caution and quick thinking had prevented a dangerous encounter. In the days after, I stayed with friends in town, unable to stop replaying the events. I realized that isolation, no matter how peaceful it seems, leaves you vulnerable. It's not ghosts or fairy tales that are dangerous. It's the reality of human unpredictability, the way someone could be lurking where you least expect it. I went back to the cabin once the authorities cleared it, determined to collect my belongings. The cabin looked peaceful in daylight, sun streaming through the windows, water glinting in the lake. Everything seemed normal, almost serene. Yet, I moved quickly, packed everything efficiently, and left, never looking back until the car was out of the forest. The experience changed the way I viewed solitude. I still love the woods, still crave isolation, but I learned to respect it. Silence is not always peace, and the feeling of being watched is not always imagination. I returned to my city life, but I carry the memory with me. The sharp awareness of how quickly comfort can turn into fear, and how careful one must be when alone in the wilderness. I learned that preparation, vigilance, and respect for the unknown aspects of the natural world are essential. Most importantly, I realized that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters but people, or the mere possibility that someone could be watching you when you think you are completely alone. I keep a small map from that trip on my wall now, marking the trails I walked, the places where I felt the most fear. It's a reminder of the balance between adventure and caution. I still go into forests, still enjoy the quiet. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted a week alone in the woods, a place far from the noise of the city and the constant pull of other people. The cabin I rented was small, made entirely of weathered wood, and nestled deep in a forest of pine and fir. The GPS dropped me at the edge of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the sunlight in patches. The last mile to the cabin was rough, and the car barely made it through the ruts and mud puddles. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows that made the forest look darker than it actually was. I parked and stepped out, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing in around me. There was no sound except the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint creak of old branches swaying in the wind. The cabin itself was simple, a single story with a steep roof, a small porch, and a wood-burning stove inside. The smell of aged wood and damp pine hit me the moment I opened the door. Dust motes floated in the air, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I set my backpack down and began unpacking. My plan was simple: spend the week reading, writing, hiking during the day, and cooking simple meals over the stove. I wanted the isolation, the silence, and the feeling of being completely disconnected. That first night, after a small dinner of canned beans and bread, I lit a fire in the stove. The warmth spread quickly through the room, and I sank into the worn armchair by the window. Outside, the forest was black, almost solid, with only the faint glint of moonlight through the treetops. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch and the distant hoot of an owl. The sounds were normal, the sounds of a forest at night, yet for some reason, I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it was just my imagination. Sleep came slowly. Every small sound made me tense, and I found myself waking repeatedly to the creaks of the cabin settling. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something moving outside the window. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other small animal, but then I heard a heavier thud, like a footstep, and it moved closer to the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up, listening intently. Another thud, slow and deliberate, came from the side of the cabin. I strained my eyes in the darkness, trying to make out a shape, but all I saw were the shadows of the trees. I stayed frozen in the chair, telling myself it was nothing, that animals made strange sounds at night, that the wind moved branches in ways that could sound like footsteps. Hours passed, and eventually the sound stopped. I dozed lightly, never fully sleeping, every nerve in my body on edge. The next morning, I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft with recent rain, and I noticed footprints in the mud. Large, heavy footprints, not animal tracks. They led around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever had been outside had walked right up to the cabin. No one else was supposed to be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car since the GPS dropped me off. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. The forest was beautiful in the sunlight, with long rays cutting through the trees and illuminating patches of moss and wildflowers. I forced myself to enjoy it, to focus on the trail under my boots, the sound of the river a mile away, the way the birds moved through the canopy. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept imagining shadows among the trees, shapes moving just out of the corner of my eye. Returning to the cabin, I double-checked the locks. Every window, every door, even the small hatch to the basement. Everything was secure. I ate another simple dinner and tried to settle in for the night. The fire in the stove gave off a warm glow, but it couldn't chase away the feeling of unease. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, I could hear them circling the cabin, slow, deliberate, heavy. My stomach turned. I crouched by the window, straining to see in the darkness. A shadow moved past, just at the edge of my vision, tall, human-shaped. My breath caught. I realized then that I was not prepared for this. I had imagined isolation as peaceful, but the reality was frightening. The quiet of the forest was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. Every crack of wood, every rustle of leaves became amplified. I thought about calling the police, but the cell signal was weak, barely one bar, and I didn't know how long it would take them to reach me. I was alone, trapped in a cabin with someone outside who didn't belong. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-alertness. I moved quietly, checking every corner of the cabin. I grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it in front of me like a shield. The footsteps came and went, but never at the same time, never too close, never too far. By morning, exhaustion had set in. I hadn't slept, and my mind was fraying. The next day, I made a plan. I couldn't stay in the cabin, not with someone potentially outside watching, waiting. I decided to hike back to the main road, even though it was miles away. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials: my backpack, water, and the small amount of food I had left. I moved silently, every sound I made amplified in the quiet of the forest. I kept checking behind me, but saw nothing. The forest was deceptive. It could hide a person easily, and every shadow made me tense. I kept to the trails as best I could, though many were overgrown. Hours passed. My legs ached. My backpack felt heavy, and the fear never left me. At one point, I stumbled and fell, twisting my ankle slightly. Panic surged, but I forced myself to keep moving. The thought of being trapped in the cabin with whoever had been outside was unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the dirt road. The sight of it filled me with relief. I could hear the distant hum of a car engine, and I began waving my arms frantically. A vehicle appeared over the next rise, and I ran toward it, limping but determined. The driver stopped, and though I couldn't communicate much through my exhaustion and fear, I managed to indicate that I needed help. They called the local authorities. When the police arrived at the cabin later, they found evidence that someone had been living near the cabin for weeks. Makeshift bedding, food wrappers, and tools were hidden in the underbrush around the building. Whoever it was, they had watched me, learned my routines, and moved in and out of sight. The police increased patrols in the area, and the cabin was eventually closed to rentals. I never returned to that forest. I thought about it often, about the sense of being watched, about the darkness of the trees and the sound of heavy footsteps in the night. But I also felt grateful. I had survived by staying calm, by paying attention, and by moving when the moment came. It was a lesson in vigilance, in respect for the unknown in seemingly ordinary places. I never romanticized isolation again. I realized how quickly it could turn dangerous when other people were involved. In the months that followed, I found myself drawn to nature again, but never to a place so remote. I learned to trust my instincts, to notice patterns, to always have a plan. And though the memory of that cabin still caused a shiver, I also carried with me a sense of accomplishment. I had faced a real danger, not a storybook monster, not a ghost, but a real human threat. And I had survived, clear-headed and careful, and that survival gave me a deep sense of clarity and strength I carry to this day. I had been planning the trip for months, the kind of trip that promised solitude and a chance to escape everything familiar. The cabin was tucked away in a dense forest in the northern mountains, far from towns or roads. I had found it online, a small rental run by a quiet, older man who promised that the cabin was isolated and private. I liked the idea of being completely alone, away from the hum of traffic, the constant notifications, the endless demands of modern life. I packed enough food and water for a week, a first aid kit, some firewood, and my camera. I wanted to document the wilderness, to walk through it in silence and take in everything without anyone else around. The drive there was long, the road narrowing as I climbed higher into the mountains. The trees grew denser, the sky above the canopy darker. I had to stop a few times to check the map, but the directions were accurate, leading me down a winding dirt track that ended in a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was exactly like the pictures, old but solid, made of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a stone chimney. Smoke curled from the chimney, though the place looked empty. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and walked up to the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchen with basic appliances, and a lofted bedroom. The floors creaked slightly under my weight, and the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. I dropped my bag and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. A branch tapping against the window, the wind shifting the trees outside, the faint scurrying of small animals somewhere in the walls. I unpacked my supplies, stacked the firewood neatly, and checked my emergency kit. I made sure I had everything ready in case something went wrong. Afterward, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I wanted to see the terrain, the trails, the streams that the cabin listing had mentioned. The first few hours were uneventful. Birds chirped, a squirrel darted across my path. The sun filtered through the tall pine trees, painting the forest floor with shifting patterns of light. Felt serene, almost meditative. As evening approached, I returned to the cabin and started a fire. I cooked a simple meal on the stove and ate while sitting on the porch, looking out at the darkening forest. The shadows grew long and tangled, and the silence deepened. By the time I went to bed, the cabin was fully dark, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of moonlight through the window. I slept uneasily, the kind of sleep where you feel like someone could be watching, even though you know logically that no one is. The next morning, I woke early. I made coffee on the stove, feeling the heat and smell of it fill the small cabin. I planned to hike a trail I had seen the day before, a path that followed a ridge above a narrow river. I packed water, a snack, and my camera and set out. The trail was steeper than I had expected. Rocks and roots made every step cautious, and I had to focus on where I placed my feet to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest was dense, and I realized quickly that this part of the trail was not frequently used. I was glad I had my phone and a compass, though I knew signal would be unreliable this far in. As I hiked, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, scratch marks on trees, a distant rustling that made me pause. I took pictures, trying to capture the isolation, the untouched feeling of this place. The deeper I went, the more the forest closed around me. Sunlight barely reached the ground, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I was aware of the growing weight of silence, the absence of human sound, and it made my heart beat faster. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing that overlooked the river far below. The view was incredible, a wide, rushing stream cutting through the valley, with mossy rocks lining the banks. I stayed there for a while, just observing. Then, I started back, wanting to return to the cabin before dark. It was on the way back that I first sensed something was off. The trail, which had seemed clear in the morning, now looked different. Fallen branches lay in places where they hadn't been before, and I felt certain I had passed a certain tree, only to see it again. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was tired or my mind was playing tricks. But then I heard it, a sound that did not belong to the forest. It was soft at first, a faint crunch of leaves, and then it grew louder. Footsteps? I stopped and listened. My own breathing seemed deafening, but I didn't hear another sound. I moved slowly, every sense alert. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows stretching in impossible angles. I tried to pick up my pace, but the trail seemed to twist unexpectedly. It was disorienting, as if I was going in circles. My heart started to race, every branch snapping underfoot, every bird taking flight suddenly, sent jolts of fear through me. I reached for my phone, hoping for GPS, but there was no signal. Panic began to set in. I had been careful, always marking my path, but now the forest seemed alien, dangerous. Then I saw it, a figure. Not a person exactly, at first it was just a shadow. Then I realized it was a man. He was moving slowly along the trail, partially hidden by trees, watching me. I froze. There was nothing about him that indicated friendliness, and something in his stance told me I was being assessed, considered. I knew instantly that I needed to get away, but turning back the way I came felt wrong. I didn't know if he was blocking the trail. I started moving quietly, stepping off the trail, weaving through the trees, trying to put distance between us. Every step I took was careful, deliberate, but I could hear him moving too, faintly, the crunch of leaves keeping time with my own racing heartbeat. I realized I had left the trail entirely and had no idea which way led back to the cabin. Panic was rising. I had a sense that this was not a random encounter. He had been waiting, and I had stumbled into him. I kept moving, staying low, using the trees for cover. Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dangerous shadows. I stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped my hands on bark, but kept moving. Every time I thought I saw the cabin in the distance, it turned out to be another set of trees, another illusion. Exhaustion and fear combined into a heavy weight. I had to keep going. Eventually, I found a small creek. Water. I drank cautiously and followed it downstream, reasoning that it might lead me back to a larger body of water or the cabin. The sound of moving water helped mask my own steps, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The figure had disappeared, but I didn't believe he had gone. He was somewhere out there, following, waiting. Night fell completely while I was still moving along the creek. I had no flashlight, just the dim light of the moon, and my energy was almost gone. My clothes were wet, my hands cut from rocks, my legs scratched by branches. I was hungry and dehydrated, and my mind was starting to play tricks. I thought I heard voices, footsteps, rustling in multiple directions, but I knew it was just my fear magnifying the sounds of the forest. I came to a point where the creek widened, forming a small pool. I stopped, resting my hands on my knees, trying to think. I couldn't go back, I couldn't go forward blindly. I needed to find the cabin, to get somewhere safe, to have a fire and warmth. I remembered the ridge I had passed earlier, the high point that had overlooked the river. If I could get there, I might be able to spot the cabin. Climbing uphill in the dark was dangerous. Rocks were slippery, branches blocked my path, and I had to move slowly to avoid injury. My legs shook with fatigue, my lungs burned, and every shadow seemed alive. But eventually, I reached the top, gasping, soaked in sweat and dirt. I scanned the darkness below. Finally, I saw it. The faint outline of the cabin, smoke rising from the chimney. I didn't know if someone had started a fire or if it was residual from earlier, but it was enough. I had a target, a place of safety. I descended carefully, moving quickly now that I had direction. Every step felt precarious, but the sight of the cabin kept me focused. I reached the clearing and finally made it to the porch, collapsing on the wooden boards. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door, finally managing to push it open. Inside, I lit the stove and built a fire, my hands still trembling as I stacked the logs. The warmth filled me, but it didn't erase the fear, the sense that I had been hunted. I barricaded the door as best I could with furniture and locks, and sat by the fire until exhaustion claimed me. The next morning, I left the cabin cautiously. I packed quickly, took one last look around, and drove down the dirt track, heart still hammering. I told no one where I had been, except for a brief message to a friend after I reached the first town. The forest behind me looked calm, serene, but I knew the reality, the isolation, the danger, the sense of being watched. I never returned to that cabin. I had been planning this trip for months, the idea forming first as a vague thought and then becoming a firm goal I could not let go. I wanted a few days alone in the wilderness, away from the constant buzz of the city, the lights, the traffic, the endless noise and pressure that had been pressing down on me for years. It was supposed to be simple. A small cabin in a remote forest, basic supplies, my backpack, and a few days of quiet, just me and nature. I found a cabin online, far from any town, tucked deep into a forest of pine and oak. It was old but maintained, with running water, a small stove, and a log pile stacked neatly by the side. The photos made it look inviting, isolated enough to be private, but not so far that reaching it would be dangerous. I convinced myself I could handle the isolation, that a few days in the woods would be refreshing. I had no idea how wrong I was. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the road. The last stretch was rough, dirt and gravel with potholes that shook the car, and as I drove, I realized how isolated it really was. Not a single house for miles, not even a clearing with a small shack. Only forest in every direction, trees tall and close, dark and silent. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff back and feeling the quiet of the forest close around me. The air smelled of damp pine and earth. Birds called somewhere far off, their sounds echoing through the stillness. The cabin itself was small but solid. The logs were darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it was intact. A thin trail of smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Whoever maintained this place had kept it tidy, at least on the surface. The first few hours were comforting. I unloaded my bags, stacked firewood, and lit the stove. The small space inside was warm, cozy even. I spread out my sleeping bag on the floor near the stove and started a small fire, the wood crackling and sending sparks up into the chimney. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice, savoring the quiet. Outside, the forest seemed to wait, patient and still, and I felt a sense of satisfaction at having gotten here safely. I made a note to myself to enjoy the evening light. As the darkness deepened, the forest's calm started to feel different. The wind picked up slightly, making the tops of the pines sway and groan. Shadows moved across the cabin walls as the fire flickered. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, the sound of the fire, and the smell of burning wood. Still, a part of me couldn't help noticing how completely alone I was. No distant traffic, no passing hikers, no sound of a town nearby, just me and the forest. Night came fast. I turned off the lights inside, letting the fire cast a warm glow across the room. Outside, it was darker than anything I had experienced in years. The moon was half hidden by clouds, casting pale light that barely reached the ground through the thick canopy. The wind moved through the trees, whispering in a way that made the branches sound like they were scraping against each other. I tried to sleep, telling myself this was normal, that the wind always made strange sounds in the forest. But sleep came fitfully. Every small noise outside made me tense, and every shadow cast by the fire seemed larger than it should be. At one point, I could have sworn I saw movement outside the small window, a shape that seemed to shift behind the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the way shadows played against the dark. Still, I found myself lying awake for hours, staring at the fire, listening to the forest and wondering how the night could be so alive and yet so empty at the same time. Morning brought light and with it relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, golden and bright, and the cabin felt safe again. I made breakfast, toasted some bread, and brewed coffee over the stove. I decided to take a walk, to explore the area before the day got too hot. The forest was beautiful in the light, every leaf and blade of grass detailed and sharp. Birds moved through the trees, small mammals scuttled through the underbrush, and the occasional squirrel chattered as I passed. I followed a narrow trail I had seen from the cabin, the earth soft beneath my boots and the smell of pine strong in the air. I felt good, alive. For a few hours, it seemed like exactly the peaceful retreat I had wanted. Then I noticed the signs: broken branches, scuffed patches of earth, small footprints in the soft soil near the trail. At first, I thought it might be deer or another animal, but the shape was wrong, too large and too flat to be anything I recognized. My stomach sank as I realized the prints were human. I couldn't see any direction they led, the underbrush thick, but the forest had been empty when I left the cabin. Whoever had made those prints had come while I was out, and I hadn't heard a thing. That was the first time I realized just how vulnerable I really was. My mind tried to reason it out. Maybe a hiker had passed, someone just exploring, someone who didn't mean harm. But the sense of being watched settled in, cold and persistent, like ice spreading under my skin. I returned to the cabin quickly, checking every corner as I went inside. The door was locked, the windows closed. Nothing had been moved. Everything looked exactly as I left it. But the feeling didn't go away. I started to notice details I had ignored before. The way the shadows from the trees stretched across the floor, the faint sound of something scraping against the cabin walls when the wind moved, the odd smell in the air, metallic and sharp. I kept reminding myself it was normal, that the forest had sounds and smells I wasn't used to, but the unease continued. I spent the rest of the day inside, pacing, checking the locks, peering out the windows. I barely ate, drank little water, and kept the fire going. Even the sunlight couldn't chase away the feeling that something had been there, watching, moving through the woods. By the second night, my sense of isolation had become fear. The wind had shifted, bringing colder air that cut through the cabin. Couldn't sleep. Every small sound outside, every shift in shadow, made my heart race. I kept a knife in my hand and the stove poker close by, ready in case someone entered. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the deck outside. I froze, barely breathing, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my body tense, my mind racing. There was no sign of anyone outside when I finally dared to look. Still, the thought lingered. Someone had been out there, near my cabin, and the realization made my stomach twist with panic. The next morning, I decided I could not stay another night. I packed quickly, pulling together my supplies, my food, my clothing, everything I could carry. But when I went to start the car, I discovered another problem. The battery was dead. I tried again and again, but the engine refused to turn over. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like a trap. I walked around the car, checking connections, trying to find anything that might work. My mind raced through every possible solution. There was no cell phone service, no neighbors within miles. If something went wrong, no one would know I was here. Panic began to settle in fully, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I decided to go on foot. I had a general sense of the direction back to the main road, a map I had printed before the trip, and I started walking, trying to follow the faint trail I had noticed earlier. The forest was thicker than I remembered in daylight. Underbrush tore at my pants, roots caught my boots, and every rustle made me jump. I moved slowly, carefully, scanning every shadow, every movement. Hours passed. I had no water left, my stomach growled, and the sun began to dip once more, threatening to leave me in darkness again. I realized that my careful planning had failed. I was not prepared to navigate the forest alone for this long, with no way to call for help, and no way to know if I was moving in the right direction. Night came again, and I found a small clearing to rest. I built a small fire, just enough to keep me warm, and tried to sleep sitting up. The forest felt alive in ways I had never considered before. Every crack, snap, and rustle made me jump. I could not shake the feeling of eyes on me, even though I knew logically that most likely I was alone. Still, the fear was real, raw, and it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I lay awake, staring at the darkness, listening to the distant calls of owls and the wind moving through the trees. My hands shook, my body ached, and my thoughts raced in circles. The night seemed endless. The next morning, I set out again, moving with more determination. Hunger and exhaustion were becoming unbearable. Every step felt heavier than the last. I stumbled, scraped my hands on branches, twisted my ankle once, but kept moving. I tried to follow the map, trying to find the main trail I remembered seeing near the car, but the forest seemed endless. The trees I remember the first time I decided to spend a weekend alone in that old cabin deep in the forest. I had found it through an online listing, tucked away in a remote part of the mountains. It was the kind of place that promised isolation, a place to get away from everything, from the noise of the city and the constant hum of other people's lives. The pictures online made it seem charming, rustic wood siding, a stone chimney, a small porch that looked out onto dense pine trees. I thought it would be the perfect way to spend some time alone, to clear my mind. What I didn't realize was just how far removed from civilization it really was, and how unprepared I would be for the things that followed. I arrived late in the afternoon, after a long drive winding up narrow mountain roads. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled clean and sharp, full of pine and wet earth, but it also carried a quiet stillness that felt unnatural. The closer I got to the cabin, the more isolated it felt. There were no other houses, no signs of human life, just the dark green of the forest pressing in on both sides of the road. When I finally turned onto the gravel path leading to the cabin, the tires of my car crunched loudly, echoing through the trees in a way that made me tense up. The cabin itself looked even smaller and lonelier in person than in the photos. Its wood siding was weathered and dark, the roof streaked with years of rain and snow. I parked and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at it, realizing that I was completely alone in a place where no one would see me if something went wrong. The cabin was dark inside, and I fumbled to get the keys from my bag. Once inside, the smell of dust and old wood hit me. It was the kind of smell that made your throat itch and your eyes water a little. The interior was simple. A small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a couch covered in a faded blanket, a fireplace, and a bedroom with a sagging mattress. I set my bag down, unpacked some essentials, and decided to start a fire in the fireplace before nightfall. The wood was dry, stacked neatly in a corner, and I managed to get a small flame going. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting long shadows. It made the room feel warmer, but also brought the emptiness of the cabin into sharp focus. I sat on the couch and watched the flames dance, trying to convince myself I had made the right choice coming here alone. Night fell quickly. I had brought a lantern, extra batteries, and a flashlight, but even with these, the darkness outside the cabin felt infinite. The wind moved through the trees with a soft moan, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I tried to distract myself, unpacking food and organizing my things, but a part of me kept listening to the forest outside. Occasionally, I heard a branch snap, a sound that seemed much closer than it should have been. My mind tried to rationalize it. An animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but there was a weight in the silence that made me uneasy. I went to check the locks on the doors and windows, each one old and stiff. I double-checked them, making sure they were secure, though the thought that someone or something could be out there crept into my mind. The first night was restless. I woke multiple times, convinced I heard footsteps outside the cabin, soft and deliberate, though nothing was there when I looked. The wind rattled the windows, and small animals skittered across the roof and walls. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each time waking me with a start. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking, that isolation had a way of amplifying sounds and fears. I knew I wasn't imagining everything. My instincts were on high alert, but I refused to let fear take control. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I brought a backpack with water, snacks, a knife, and my flashlight, just in case. The trees were dense, the ground uneven, and the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I wandered along a narrow trail, noting how easy it would be to get lost if I strayed too far. Hours passed, and I returned to the cabin before sunset, feeling a mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. The isolation was starting to press on me more than I expected. That night, the sounds of the forest seemed louder. There were rustlings in the underbrush, the wind shaking the branches, and an occasional distant howl that I assumed was a coyote. Still, I tried to keep my mind rational, reminding myself that I was alone but not in immediate danger. It was the third night when things escalated. I had been preparing dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and bread, when I noticed something strange through the window. A figure, tall and dark, was standing among the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart hammered in my chest. I froze, straining my eyes, but it didn't move. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree, but there was no denying the shape. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, and for a moment the figure seemed to vanish. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation and fear were getting to me. I decided to stay calm and keep busy inside, locking the doors and windows again. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every small sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me tense. I kept the fire going, and when it dimmed, I used the lantern to illuminate the room. I noticed something I hadn't before: marks on the porch, footprints, not human, but large, deep, and uneven. My stomach sank. Someone had been outside, close to the cabin, while I was inside. I thought of calling the police, but the cell signal was weak, almost non-existent. The landline in the cabin was old, with a crackling dial tone. I felt trapped, completely exposed, and vulnerable. I spent the night sitting by the fire, every nerve on edge. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The wind outside felt like it was carrying whispers, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. I thought about leaving, driving back down the mountain, but it was dark and I didn't want to risk getting lost or stuck on the narrow road. Morning brought some relief. The footprints were gone, but the unease remained. I packed my backpack, just in case I needed to leave quickly, and tried to focus on tasks inside the cabin to keep my mind occupied. The following day, I explored further, staying on the marked trails and keeping an eye on the forest around me. I spotted signs of animals, rabbits, deer, a fox, but nothing threatening. Still, I kept thinking about the previous night and those footprints. Whoever or whatever had been there had disappeared without a trace. I started to realize how unprepared I had been for real isolation. In the city, danger was abstract. Out here, it was tangible, immediate, and it made my mind race with possibilities. I returned to the cabin before dark, feeling tense but determined to finish the weekend without incident. The next night, I heard movement outside again, closer this time. It sounded deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded, and I felt trapped in a way I had never experienced before. I armed myself with a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife, staying in the center of the cabin where I could see all the doors and windows. The sounds went on for hours, circling, pausing, and then moving again. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone had been out there. Fear twisted in my stomach, making every second feel endless. I sat by the fire, trying to steady my breathing, thinking about what I would do if someone tried to get inside. I reminded myself that I had options: the car, the trail down the mountain, the knife in my hand. I had to stay calm and think clearly. By the time the sun began to rise, the forest grew quiet. The wind calmed, the animals retreated, and I allowed myself a brief moment of relief. I inspected the doors and windows. Everything was still intact, no signs of forced entry. I realized then how lucky I had been. Whoever or whatever had been out there had chosen not to confront me directly. I decided that after breakfast I would leave. I didn't care about finishing the weekend or enjoying solitude anymore. Safety was more important than pride or adventure. The morning was tense but uneventful. I packed everything, made sure the fire was completely out, and carefully locked the cabin. I took one last look around, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering dread. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, but I couldn't see it without the shadow of the previous night's events. As I drove down the mountain, every rustle in the trees, every sound of the wind, made me flinch. I kept reminding myself that I was leaving, that I was safe now, that I had survived the weekend without harm. But the sense of being watched, the thought that someone had been so close without me knowing, stayed with me long after I returned to the city. After that trip, I swore I would never go into the forest alone again. I realized that isolation can magnify fear, make every sound suspicious, and turn even a simple weekend away into a trial of endurance. The cabin itself was not dangerous. The forest was not inherently. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself it was about escaping the city, about silence and air so clean it almost hurt your lungs. The cabin was tucked far into the mountains, a place I had found on a map and then discovered through a series of sparse online reviews. The directions were vague but promising, and I liked the idea of reaching somewhere that few people ever went. By the time I pulled my car onto the narrow, unpaved road that led to the cabin, the sun was already low, spilling gold across the tops of pine trees. The drive had been long, through winding roads that barely fit two cars side by side, the edges of the road dropping sharply to the dark valley below. I felt a little thrill mixed with unease. It was beautiful but intimidating in a way that made my stomach tighten. The last stretch of road was rough, littered with rocks and deep grooves carved by rain. My car shook and rattled as I pushed forward, following the small signs nailed to trees, handwritten, primitive arrows that seemed both welcoming and warning. At one point, a fallen branch blocked half the road, forcing me to drive around it carefully, watching for unseen ditches. I caught the first glimpse of the cabin as the road curved sharply to the left. It sat on a small clearing, a modest wooden structure with faded paint, slightly leaning but solid. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, though the place seemed deserted. Parking the car near the side of the cabin, I stepped out, stretching stiff muscles and letting the air fill my lungs. It was quiet in a way that felt alive. Birds called faintly from deep in the forest, and somewhere water moved, a distant stream or perhaps runoff from the mountains. I felt the first shiver of nervous excitement. I had come here alone and the isolation was total. Not even a cell signal. I knew this ahead of time. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old stone. I pushed open the door and found the interior even more worn than I had imagined from the photos. Dust coated the floorboards, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the furniture was minimal. A small table, 2 chairs, a single bed in a back corner, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag and began inspecting. I had brought supplies for 3 days. Canned food, bottled water, a small propane stove, and blankets. The feeling of being utterly alone settled over me as I moved around the cabin, touching the walls and imagining the winters this place must have endured. I started a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the chill and unpacked. The first night was peaceful, though I kept waking at odd hours, hearing noises outside, the rustle of branches, the snap of a twig. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or perhaps deer moving through the underbrush. By morning, the sun slanted through the small windows, and I felt better, as if I had passed the first test of solitude. On the second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat near a narrow ridge, the ground sloping sharply down on one side to a dense forest and on the other to a steep incline leading further up the mountain. I hiked carefully, noting the way the trees thinned out into rocky patches where the ground fell away. I felt alive here, fully aware of every step, every crack of rock beneath my boots. I stayed close to the paths I could see, though most were faint, probably used only by animals. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon a small stream fed by a spring. The water was clear, cold, and invigorating. I filled a bottle and drank greedily, feeling the refreshing burn in my throat. That evening, I cooked a simple meal over the stove. Canned beans and a bit of bread I had brought along. The cabin seemed even quieter than the night before, though now I noticed subtle things. The occasional shift of the floorboards, a strange creaking from the roof rafters. I couldn't see anything outside, only the dark shapes of trees pressing in. I tried not to think about it. The third day is when things started to feel wrong. I woke to a dull, persistent sound, a scratching, soft but distinct, coming from outside. I froze in bed, listening. It wasn't the wind. I lay very still, straining to hear. The sound stopped and then started again, closer this time, scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart pounded. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the table and edged toward the door. The scratches stopped as soon as I moved, replaced by faint thumps. Something was out there. I reminded myself logically. It could be a bear, or a large raccoon, or a deer rubbing against the cabin. I had no weapons beyond a small pocket knife, but I told myself that large predators usually avoid humans. Still, I decided not to leave the cabin that day. I kept the stove burning longer than usual, paced the small room, and tried to ignore the occasional sounds outside. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every wind gust sounded like something moving through the brush. I realized how unprepared I was for real wilderness solitude. It was one thing to think about being alone. It was another to feel it pressing in from all sides. By late afternoon, I thought I heard something approaching the cabin, heavier than an animal. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, listening. A low growl or groan, impossible to tell, came from the edge of the clearing. I considered leaving, driving back down the road, but I realized the sun was already low, and the rough road would be treacherous in the dark. I fortified the cabin the only way I could, stacking some furniture against the door, making sure I had a clear view of the windows. I stayed alert, sitting in a chair near the stove, knife in hand. The night stretched, long and tense. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump. The next morning, I ventured cautiously outside. My heart sank. There were tracks in the dirt, too large to be a deer. They led from the edge of the forest to the side of the cabin and then disappeared into the trees again. My mind raced. What had been out there? I marked the tracks in my notebook, trying to analyze them. They were not human, not quite bear-like either. Something large, something strong. I felt foolish for ever thinking I could relax here. I decided to descend the mountain at least partway to scout a nearby road that might lead to help if needed. The path down was steep and treacherous. Loose rocks slipped under my boots, and the forest seemed denser here, pressing against me with shadows that seemed too solid. I moved slowly, deliberately, scanning constantly. I felt the weight of the tracks behind me, though I had no evidence anyone or anything had followed. Still, the feeling was enough to make me cautious. Halfway down, I heard a deep rustle in the underbrush, a snapping of branches as if something had burst through in a rush. My body froze, every nerve alert. I waited, but only silence followed. My mind raced through the possibilities. Wild animal, fallen tree, just wind. I pressed on, shaking but determined. By evening, I had reached a flatter section and could see a faint outline of a dirt road below, though no cars or houses. I returned to the cabin as night fell, more tense than ever, but reassured I had seen a possible exit route. The following days were a mix of tension and vigilance. I reinforced the cabin where I could, kept the fire going, and rationed food carefully. I explored short distances during the day, never straying far. I kept checking the tracks I sometimes found near the clearing. One morning, I discovered a large, broken branch leaning against the cabin door. Not recent, but freshly broken and deliberately placed, as if to test me. I started sleeping fully clothed, knife under my pillow, flashlight at the ready. On the fourth night, a storm hit. Rain hammered the roof, wind shook the cabin, and I huddled near the stove, listening as the forest screamed around me. During a lull, I heard movement outside, soft, almost careful. I shone the flashlight toward the noise and saw nothing, only rain and darkness. I forced myself to calm down. Whatever had left the tracks, whatever had scratched at the cabin, could not reach me now. I waited for morning with every muscle tense, praying the storm would obscure any tracks or paths. The next day, I ventured out after the storm. The world smelled of wet earth, moss and pine. The ground was slippery, but the rain had washed away some of the tracks, erasing evidence. I realized I needed to get out of here before I grew careless. Using the faint road I had seen, I packed my things quickly, double-checked that I had enough water and food, and started the descent. The road was steep and treacherous, slick from the storm, but I moved carefully, pausing frequently to rest. I felt completely exposed, aware of every sound. Birds, wind, falling water. Everything seemed magnified. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees above, a dark figure slipping between trunks, but by the time I blinked, it was gone. I kept moving, heart pounding, aware that in the wilderness, mistakes were costly. By late afternoon, I reached a wider dirt. I drove along the winding mountain road, the tires crunching over patches of gravel scattered across the narrow asphalt. The trees on either side were dense, mostly pines and oaks, their branches forming a dark canopy that almost blocked out the late afternoon sun. I had been driving for hours, leaving the small town behind, following the map to a cabin I had rented for the weekend. I had told myself I wanted a break from everything, from the constant noise of the city, the endless emails, and the people. Just me, the cabin, and the quiet. It sounded peaceful in theory, but I had no idea what awaited me out here. The cabin was tucked away in a secluded valley. There was no cell service once I passed the last sign of the town. No stores for miles, no other houses visible through the thick forest. The GPS on my phone flickered and died, leaving me relying on memory and the crumpled printed directions I had tucked into my bag. I finally spotted it at the end of a dirt path that snaked through the trees. It was a small, single-story cabin made of rough timber, with a steep roof that looked capable of shedding snow and rain, and a small porch that ran across the front. A thin plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating the stove inside was lit. I parked my car near the porch and stepped out, taking in the silence. It was heavier than I expected. Not the kind of silence that feels comfortable, but a thick, pressing silence that made me acutely aware of every sound my own body made. The creak of my boots on the gravel, the swish of my jacket as I adjusted the straps of my bag. The door opened easily with the key I had been given, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The floor was wooden, slightly uneven in places, and the walls were lined with bookshelves full of old, dusty books and cabinets that had clearly seen better days. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a living area in the center with a fireplace, and a single bedroom at the far end. I dropped my bag and walked around, running my hands along the rough timber of the walls, the furniture solid but worn. It was rustic, certainly not luxurious, but it was what I had wanted. Isolated, self-contained, a place to breathe without distractions. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. I gathered some dry wood from the stack near the porch, arranging it carefully in the metal grate. The first few matches sputtered, and I cursed under my breath, but eventually the fire caught, glowing warmly in the center of the room. I stood there for a long time, watching the flames, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. Outside, the forest was darkening, the light fading, and I realized I was completely alone. The thought gave me a small thrill. I liked the idea of being this isolated, even if a small part of me, deep in the back of my mind, felt uneasy. I unpacked some supplies from my bag, setting out canned food, a lantern, and my small camping stove. I wanted to make a simple dinner, something warm and filling. I boiled water on the stove and poured it over instant noodles, adding some canned vegetables. I ate slowly, listening to the wind outside as it picked up. The cabin creaked and groaned with the settling of the structure. Shadows stretched across the walls, cast by the flickering fire. It felt oddly alive, as if the cabin itself were aware of my presence. After dinner, I washed up at the small sink, the cold water shocking after the warmth of the fire. I looked out the window at the forest. Darkness had fallen completely. Shapes of trees shifted in the wind, and the faint rustle of leaves made me jump more than once. I told myself it was just the wind, just animals moving through the underbrush. There were bears and mountain lions in these woods, but the risk felt distant, almost abstract. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, of the forest pressing in closer than it should. I shook my head, trying to laugh off the feeling. I wasn't a child afraid of the dark anymore. I had to remind myself of that. Night fell fully, and I decided to go to bed early. I carried a lantern to the bedroom and set it on the small table next to the bed. The mattress was firm but serviceable, the sheets clean but slightly rough. I changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and climbed under the covers. The fire in the living room had died down to embers, and the cabin felt colder than before. I pulled the blanket tight around myself, trying to focus on the quiet, the way the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, the sense of being completely isolated. I drifted off to sleep, though not before noticing a faint scratching sound at the window. I assumed it was an animal and rolled over, forcing myself to ignore it. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a louder noise, a thud from somewhere outside. My heart leapt, and I froze, listening. The thud was followed by another, slower, deliberate. I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest, straining my ears. The scratching had stopped, but the thuds continued intermittently. I realized the sound was coming from the porch. Someone or something was out there. I held my breath, trying to calm myself. My first thought was a bear or a large animal searching for food, but the rhythm of the thuds was wrong, too deliberate, almost human. I debated whether to investigate. My instincts screamed to stay put, lock the door, and call for help, but the lack of cell service rendered the latter impossible. I considered grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer, then remembered I had left it there. I listened for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only 15 minutes. The thuds stopped, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the wind. I cautiously got out of bed, making sure the floorboards didn't creak, and grabbed the heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen. I crept to the door, opening it a crack, and peered out. The porch was empty, the forest beyond dark and silent. My eyes searched the shadows, tracing the outlines of trees and the uneven ground. Nothing moved. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding and closed the door. I locked it again, double-checked the windows, and returned to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every sound made me tense, every shadow made me flinch. I felt like an intruder in my own cabin, or worse, like someone was intruding in my mind, planting the idea that I was not safe here. The rest of the night passed in uneasy fits of dozing and waking. I would hear a snap of a branch, a distant animal cry, or the occasional gust of wind rattling the cabin, and my pulse would spike. By the time dawn broke, painting the forest in pale gold and gray, I felt drained, hollowed by fear and tension. The forest in the daylight looked much less threatening, but the unease lingered. I decided to go for a walk, to tire myself and regain some sense of control. I walked along the dirt path that had led to the cabin, my boots crunching on the gravel. The morning air was crisp, the scent of wet earth and pine strong and refreshing. The forest was alive with birds and small animals moving through the underbrush. I allowed myself to breathe, to enjoy the quiet beauty of the place, though a part of me remained watchful, alert. Returning to the cabin, I decided to check the perimeter. I wanted to see if there had been any evidence of animals or intruders. As I circled the cabin, my heart skipped when I saw deep, wide footprints pressed into the soft soil near the porch. They were too large to be human, yet the spacing and depth suggested something heavy and deliberate. Panic surged briefly, but I forced myself to examine the tracks calmly. I traced them a few feet into the woods. The footprints disappeared into the dense forest, leaving no clear trail. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear, a large deer, or perhaps a wild boar. The rational side of me said that human presence was unlikely. I reminded myself I was miles from the nearest town, and the forest here was known to be wild. Still, the footprints unnerved me. The next day passed in tense vigilance. I stayed mostly inside, preparing meals, cleaning the cabin, and keeping the fire going. I refused to venture far from the cabin, peeking out only when I needed to fetch more firewood. Every rustle, every shadow, every animal call set my nerves on edge. I slept little, and when I did, dreams of being trapped in the forest plagued me. I woke often, heart pounding, listening for sounds that might indicate someone or something was nearby. On the second night, the noises returned, but more subtly. There were small scratches at the door, soft thumps against the walls, the faintest whisper of movement across the porch boards. I spent hours in the living room, fire glowing, pan in hand, eyes scanning the shadows. My imagination wavered between rational explanation and fear-driven speculation. By midnight, I could no longer bear it. I wrapped myself in a blanket and lay on the floor in front of the fireplace, listening, watching, waiting. Eventually, the fire died down, and with the first light of dawn, the noises ceased again. Exhausted, I allowed myself to sleep properly. On the third day, I resolved. I never thought a simple weekend away in the woods could become one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had always loved solitude, the kind that comes with being far from towns and traffic, where the only sounds are wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I had rented a cabin through a small online listing, one of those remote spots tucked far back in a forest that seemed almost untouched. I didn't know the area, but the photos made it look perfect, small, rustic, with a stone fireplace, a tiny porch, and a small stream running nearby. I wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, the constant messages, the endless pressure of work, and just be alone for a few days. I packed lightly, only taking essentials, and drove the long, winding road to the location, my car bouncing over uneven gravel. The last few miles were rough, and my tires kicked up dust that clung to the car, coating the windshield. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as it appeared in the photos, maybe even more isolated. Pine trees surrounded it, thick and dark, and there was no neighbor in sight. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and I felt a shiver of excitement mixed with unease. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and unlocked the cabin. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a small living space, a kitchen area with basic appliances, a tiny bathroom, and a lofted bedroom with a simple bed. Dust coated the shelves, and the smell of stale wood filled the air. I set my things down, opened a window to let the fresh forest air in, and started a fire in the fireplace, enjoying the crackle of the flames. The first night passed quietly. I had prepared a simple dinner, ate it slowly, and then sat near the fire reading. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the stream bubbling nearby. The isolation was soothing. I went to bed early, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in months. Morning brought light streaming through the small windows, painting the cabin with gold. I brewed coffee over the small stove, walked outside, and stretched in the cool morning air. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling, the distant hum of insects, and the soft rush of water. I decided to explore a little before breakfast. The area was thick with undergrowth, and as I followed the stream, I noticed small tracks in the mud, deer, or perhaps a fox. I didn't think much of it at first. The forest felt safe, almost comforting, and I was alone, which I enjoyed. By the second day, I had settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and exploring, afternoons for reading or writing notes, and evenings by the fireplace. But I began to notice small things that unsettled me. My food supplies seemed to shift. I would set something down on the counter, a can of beans, a bottle of water, and later it would be slightly moved. At first, I convinced myself I had misremembered, or maybe the wind from an open window had nudged them. Then, I started noticing the tracks outside. Not animal tracks this time, but human footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. They were faint, as if someone had walked carefully, and they always stopped at the edge of the treeline. I didn't want to believe it, but the unease grew. I told myself that I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I had been reading true crime articles for weeks before this trip, and maybe my brain was simply connecting dots that didn't exist. Still, I started keeping a knife nearby and making sure the doors were locked. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. The wind sounded sharper, more menacing, and the forest felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. On the third day, I decided to leave the cabin for a while and hike further into the forest, hoping to shake off the anxiety. I packed a small backpack with water, a map, and a flashlight, and followed a trail I had noticed on a previous walk. The trail was narrow, almost hidden under moss and fallen leaves, winding through dense trees. The further I went, the more isolated it became. I was careful to mark my path so I could find my way back. Hours passed. I didn't see any animals, and no other human presence showed up. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was already low. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I approached cautiously, gripping the knife in my hand. The interior of the cabin looked untouched, yet there were subtle signs that something was off. My backpack, which I had left by the bed, had been moved to the center of the room. My water bottle, which I had left on the counter, was tipped over, water seeping into the wooden floor. Panic surged. Someone had been in my cabin. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I checked every room quickly, finding nothing else out of place, but my sense of safety was gone. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin alone, not with the thought that someone had been there, possibly watching me. I debated leaving immediately, but it was late, and the forest around me was thick. Getting out in the dark would be dangerous. I spent the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand, listening to every sound outside. The wind, the stream, the occasional rustle of leaves. All of it was magnified, amplified into a symphony of threat. I stayed awake until dawn, every minute feeling like hours. Sleep was impossible. In the morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, loaded my car, and drove away from the cabin, my heart still racing, eyes scanning the trees at every turn. The road back to civilization felt endless, but eventually, I reached a small town, filled with people and noise, and the relief was immediate. I called the property owner to report the break-in, but there was little they could do. The cabin was remote, and there were no cameras. They suggested I report it to the local authorities, which I did, but even then, the response was slow. They told me to be cautious, but the area had very little crime, and incidents like this were rare. Even after returning home, the experience haunted me. I kept replaying every detail, every sound, every shadow. I realized how vulnerable I had been in that isolated place, how quickly the feeling of safety could vanish. Over time, I made changes in my life. Locks, alarms, and a greater awareness of my surroundings. But I never fully shook the memory. It was a clear lesson in how isolation can be both comforting and dangerous, and how quickly peace can turn into fear. I never returned to that cabin, but I still think about it, the quiet forest, the faint footprints in the mud, the way I had felt watched even when I was alone. It became a story I would carry with me, a reminder that reality can be far scarier than any fiction, and that the world outside our homes is filled with dangers we often take for granted. The forest, for all its beauty, held a lesson I would never forget, that safety is never guaranteed, and even a perfect weekend retreat can turn into a nightmare if you are not vigilant. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. The city's constant noise, The endless hum of traffic, the smell of exhaust, and the constant glare of fluorescent lights had worn me down until I felt like I was walking through a haze. I needed isolation, silence, and the kind of stillness that only comes when the wind moves through trees and the stars sit in the sky with nothing to compete with them. When I found the cabin online, it seemed perfect. It was remote, hidden deep in a forested area several hours from the nearest town. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch overlooking a pond, and a thick forest surrounding it. No neighbors for miles, no internet, no cell signal. The kind of place where you could disappear from the world entirely. I booked it immediately, paying extra for a week during the fall, when the air would be crisp, the leaves golden and red, and the forest would feel almost untouched. I left on a Friday morning, taking my old SUV because the roads leading up to the cabin were rough and unpaved. The journey itself was long, and the deeper I drove into the forest, the quieter it became. The hum of the tires on gravel replaced the traffic noise, and the scent of pine and damp earth slowly pushed the city smells out of my nose. By late afternoon, I reached the final stretch of the journey, a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense trees. The map I printed showed a tiny symbol where the cabin sat, like a secret pin in a forest too large for most people to navigate. I parked at the edge of a small clearing and stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. The air was cold, sharper than I had expected, but it smelled clean, almost sweet with the decay of fallen leaves. The cabin was exactly like the photos. Rough-hewn wooden walls, a stone chimney with some moss creeping up the edges, and a porch overlooking a small pond that reflected the deep blue of the sky. I unloaded my bags slowly, taking my time to observe the forest. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow. Even as I moved my things into the cabin, I felt the weight of isolation settling over me. The cabin was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen with old appliances, a wood-burning stove, a bed with a simple quilt, a bathroom with a shower that had water flowing from a tank. There was a stack of firewood by the side of the cabin and a pile of kindling on the porch. I unpacked, laid out my things, and tried to imagine the next few days in this place. I had packed books, a notebook, a camera, enough food for a week, and firewood for warmth. No electronics except a small flashlight I kept in my bag in case of emergencies. I liked that the cabin had no signal. I wanted to exist without connection for a while. The first night was beautiful. I built a fire in the stove, feeling the heat spread through the room. The wind rustled outside, and I watched the smoke curl up from the chimney, disappearing into the dark sky. I kept a lantern lit on the porch, just enough to see the trees and the pond, and I spent hours watching the forest. Every little sound seemed significant. The scurrying of animals, the drop of water from leaves after the rain earlier in the day, the distant hoot of an owl. I fell asleep feeling calm, almost at peace, but there was a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't shake. It was nothing I could name, just a lingering sense that the forest around the cabin was vast and indifferent, and that I was very small inside it. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I packed some water, a notebook, and a camera, and I left the cabin early in the morning. The forest was dense, filled with tall pines and oaks. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots. I wandered through the trees, following small trails that twisted and turned unpredictably. Occasionally, I would come across a small clearing or a stream, where sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered beams. I noted the patterns of the trees, the moss growing on rocks, and the way the water shimmered. Everything was peaceful, yet there was an underlying intensity in the forest, an awareness that the trees had stood there for decades, centuries even, and that every footstep I took was marked and remembered in some imperceptible way. I reached the pond that I could see from the porch. It was smaller than it appeared from the cabin, but still beautiful, with smooth stones along the edge and water so still it mirrored the sky. I sat there for an hour, letting the quiet seep into me. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never experienced in the city. On the third day, the weather changed. A storm was coming, though it wasn't in the forecast. I noticed it first in the wind, which shifted suddenly, stronger and more insistent, pushing through the trees in rolling waves. The leaves rustled frantically, and the sky darkened with heavy clouds. I went inside, secured the windows, and started a fire in the stove. The wind was louder now, howling around the cabin in a way that made the walls creak and the windows vibrate. Rain began to fall, thick and cold, hammering the roof and splashing against the porch. I stayed inside, watching the storm through the small windows, feeling a mixture of fascination and unease. Being alone in the forest during a storm was different from the city. In the city, storms felt distant, softened by buildings and streets. Here, the storm was immediate, almost physical, pressing against the cabin, and I was entirely exposed to it. I tried to keep myself busy, chopping firewood and writing in my notebook, but there was a tension I couldn't ignore. By the fourth day, the storm had passed, leaving the forest wet and heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine. I noticed something strange while walking around the cabin. There were footprints in the mud, too large to be mine, leading from the forest to the edge of the clearing near the cabin. They were irregular, uneven, as if someone or something had been moving cautiously through the mud. I froze, trying to make sense of them. The tracks were fresh, definitely made in the last 24 hours, and they ended abruptly at the edge of the clearing. There was no signal from the outside world, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. My first instinct was to tell myself it was probably a deer or another large animal, but the spacing of the prints was wrong. I circled the cabin, checking all sides. Nothing else. No other signs, no damage, nothing that suggested anyone had actually approached the building beyond the tracks. Still, a chill ran down my spine. I started keeping the flashlight on the porch and made sure to lock all doors and windows, even though I had already done so many times. That night, I slept fitfully, half watching the shadows outside, feeling the isolation more acutely than ever. The fifth day was when the sense of unease turned into outright fear. I woke early, before sunrise, because something outside had made a noise, a low, guttural sound, like something moving in the underbrush. I stayed perfectly still in bed, straining to hear. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I forced myself to get up and check the perimeter. The footprints from the day before were still there, unchanged, but now I saw a second set. They were newer, overlapping the old tracks, moving in different directions around the cabin. I walked slowly around the building, checking every window and door. Nothing seemed disturbed. The realization hit me slowly. Someone was watching the cabin. There was no way to call for help, and no way to know if they were still there. The forest had become not just silent, but threatening. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best as I could, moving furniture in front of doors, checking locks repeatedly, and stacking extra firewood to make a barrier on the porch. Every sound outside, the wind, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch, made my heart race. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just a hunter or a hiker, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone had been there intentionally, waiting, watching. The sixth day was the worst. I woke to find the front door slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. Panic surged through me. I checked the inside immediately. Nothing had been stolen, nothing touched. The feeling of being observed intensified, pressing in from all sides. I spent hours moving cautiously around the cabin, checking windows, examining the perimeter, trying to convince myself that it was still just someone passing through. But by mid-afternoon, I saw evidence that made it impossible to deny. Small items I had left on the porch, a stack of kindling, a small tin of matches, had been moved slightly. Not stolen, just moved. Someone had been close enough to touch them. The reality was undeniable. I was not alone, and I had no way to contact anyone or defend myself effectively. I considered leaving immediately, but the storm from 2 days prior had left the dirt road partially washed out, making it risky to drive. I stayed inside, sitting close to the stove, keeping the fire going, and watching the shadows outside. Every noise was magnified: the snapping of a twig, the flutter of leaves, the movement of something just beyond the tree line. Sleep was impossible. My body was exhausted. I never planned to be alone in that cabin. It wasn't a deliberate choice. I thought I was prepared for it, or at least, that was the illusion I clung to as I drove along the narrow, winding dirt road that led into the forest. The sun was low, hanging at an angle that made shadows stretch long and thin between the trees, and the air carried that late summer smell of damp earth mixed with pine needles. I could feel the heat of the day lingering in the asphalt patches, and the sudden cool gusts of wind through the open windows made me shiver despite the warmth. I didn't realize it at the time, but those little warnings, the wind, the shadows, the deep hush of the forest, were the first hints that this trip would be nothing like the simple, peaceful retreat I imagined. The cabin itself was tucked in a small clearing, hidden from view until the last moment when the trees thinned enough for me to see the roof peeking through the branches. It was older than I expected, the wood darkened with age, streaked in places with gray where the sun and rain had bleached it unevenly. The porch sagged a little on one side, and the steps creaked alarmingly when I climbed them. I carried my bag and a small cooler of food and water, and every movement echoed in the silent air. There were no birds, no insects buzzing loudly, just a faint rustling from the tree-line beyond the clearing. The isolation struck me immediately, and a slight knot of anxiety formed in my stomach, one I tried to push down with rational thoughts. I told myself I had done this before, solo trips, hiking, camping, and that I was just being paranoid. The cabin smelled of wood and dust and something faintly moldy, as if it hadn't been used for months. I set down my bag and cooler, then slowly opened the windows to let in air. The light outside was fading quickly, turning the shadows in the cabin long and stark, and I noticed just how little furniture there was. A small table, 2 chairs, a battered couch with torn cushions, and a bed tucked into the far corner. The walls were bare, and there was only one small kitchen area with an old stove, a sink, and a cupboard that held mismatched plates and mugs. It all looked like it had been left behind quickly, or perhaps just neglected for years. I unpacked my things methodically, making a mental note of the layout and exits. The cabin had one main door and a back door that led to a small deck overlooking a steep drop into the forest below. The drop wasn't dangerous from a distance, but the way the ground disappeared into thick undergrowth made the forest feel like it went on forever. I checked the door locks, which were old but functional, and I even wedged a chair against the main door, just for reassurance. The effort calmed me a little, though I could feel my pulse quicken in the stillness. As the sky darkened, I started a fire in the small stone fireplace in the corner of the room. The wood was dry, stored in a stack near the cabin, and the fire took quickly, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. The shadows danced on the walls, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the isolation. There were no other houses, no roads visible beyond the clearing, no sounds of cars or people. Only the forest, vast and dense, stretching endlessly in all directions. I ate a small meal, sipping from a bottle of water, trying to enjoy the solitude, trying to convince myself I liked it. But even as I told myself this, the sense of being watched began to creep into my mind. It started subtly, a snap of a branch outside, too sharp and sudden to be the wind, a rustle in the undergrowth that didn't match the soft hum of the forest. I told myself it was deer, or perhaps a raccoon, but I could feel a tightening in my chest. When night fell completely, the darkness outside became almost solid, a black wall pressing against the cabin. I lit a few more candles and left the fire burning, though I didn't sit close to it. I felt exposed, as if the shadows themselves were pressing at the edges of the room. I tried to sleep that night, lying on the thin mattress and listening to the forest. The wind picked up, and I could hear branches scraping together in a high, almost metallic sound. Somewhere in the distance, an animal cried, a long, drawn-out sound that made the hair on my arms rise. I told myself it was probably a fox or a coyote, but the sound was too low and mournful to be ordinary. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the occasional louder crack of wood or distant animal sound. I woke multiple times, heart racing, just to listen to the forest's restless noises. By the second day, I had convinced myself to explore the surrounding area. I needed to see where I was, to understand my limits. I strapped on a small backpack with water and some food and began to walk along the edge of the clearing. The forest was thick, the trees close together, with underbrush that snagged at my legs. Every sound seemed louder here, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of birds, the whistle of wind through the trees. I kept to the paths I could see, but the forest had a way of folding in on itself, and soon I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The cabin was no longer visible, swallowed by the trees. A creeping sense of panic began to rise. I checked my map and compass, though I knew that with the dense forest, landmarks were hard to spot. I tried to mark my trail, snapping small branches or leaving small piles of rocks, but it quickly became clear that I might not find my way back as easily as I thought. The sun was still high, but I knew from experience that it would set fast, and night in the forest was a different kind of darkness, one that felt suffocating and alive. I forced myself to turn back, retracing my steps carefully, but with every bend and ridge, I felt more disoriented. The panic escalated when I heard something moving behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, different from the crackle of leaves under my own feet. I froze, listening, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped when I stopped. My mind raced through possibilities: another hiker, a hunter, a wild animal. The rational side of me wanted to calm down, but my body tensed as I turned slowly, trying to catch a glimpse of anything in the dense undergrowth. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I started walking faster, careful not to run, but alert to every sound. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of movement, sent jolts of fear through me. I made it back to the cabin just as the light began to fade, the forest around me becoming a gray blur that swallowed detail and depth. I bolted the doors and windows, and even then, the sense of unease lingered. I stayed near the fireplace, tending the flames and eating a meager dinner, my mind spinning with scenarios of getting lost, of encountering a wild animal, of being trapped with no one for miles. I tried to reason with myself, to remember the times I had been in the woods alone and been fine, but this felt different. The isolation pressed on me, and the knowledge that no one would know if something happened created a heaviness that I couldn't shake. That night, the noises grew louder. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old cabin groan. Branches scraped the walls outside, sharp and insistent. I lay awake, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Around midnight, I heard a thud against the back door, low and heavy. I froze, my mind racing. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something was trying to test the barrier. I grabbed a heavy lamp and stood near the door, listening as the thud repeated, once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that makes you question if you heard anything at all. Sleep finally came in short, broken bursts, and I woke before dawn, muscles tense, eyes burning. I forced myself to eat breakfast, but I couldn't shake the fear. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift toward me. I spent the morning checking the perimeter, looking for signs of wildlife or humans. There were tracks, some animal, I hoped, but no other signs of life. Still, the sense of being watched remained, like the forest itself had a presence beyond what I could see. I realized I couldn't stay idle any longer. I needed to leave. The road back was narrow and winding, and the forest could easily obscure it if I took a wrong turn. I packed everything quickly, leaving nothing behind, and set off along the dirt path, trying to keep calm and focused. The first hour was fine. The sun was higher now, the shadows shorter, and the forest seemed less oppressive. But then, I noticed footprints beside the road, fresh and human-sized. They weren't mine. My stomach dropped, quickened my pace, my heart hammering. The prints followed the road, and as I glanced behind me, I realized that whatever had made them was not far away. I kept moving, telling myself to stay calm, to focus on the road and the sun and the sound of my own feet. But the feeling of being followed grew stronger. Twigs snapped behind me at irregular intervals, always when I paused or slowed. I couldn't see anything, yet I could feel eyes on me. I began to jog, then run, my legs burning, lungs aching. The dirt road twisted and turned, and every curve seemed to bring the forest closer, swallowing the I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of a secluded cabin in the woods had always appealed to me. The thought of being completely away from everything, without phones, emails, or the constant noise of the city, felt like a necessity. I wanted a break from the routine, a chance to clear my head, and the thought of being deep in the wilderness, completely alone, was the most attractive option I could imagine. The cabin was small, rustic, and isolated, located several miles from the nearest town. The directions were vague, and the last stretch of the road was nothing more than a dirt track lined with thick pine and birch trees. I packed carefully, bringing supplies for several days: canned food, a small gas stove, extra blankets, a lantern, a first aid kit, and, because I am cautious by nature, a hunting knife. I had no intention of needing it for hunting, but it gave me a sense of security to know I had something to defend myself with, even if only against a wild animal or unforeseen mishap. The drive was long, tires crunching over gravel and dirt, and as I got closer to the cabin, the forest became denser, the road narrower. Felt more like a path than a road. The sky was beginning to shift to the pale orange of early evening when I finally saw it. The cabin was small, constructed of dark wood, with a steep roof and a single chimney. It was simple, almost painfully plain, but that was part of its charm. A small creek ran nearby, and the smell of pine and damp earth was everywhere. I parked the car at the edge of a small clearing, unloaded my bags, and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, crisp in a way that made me shiver slightly, but it also carried a clarity that I hadn't felt in a long time. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint mustiness that came from disuse. Dust covered the corners, and cobwebs hung like forgotten curtains from the ceiling. I set my things down and lit the small gas stove I had brought for heat and cooking. The cabin had a wood stove, but the previous occupant had left it wet and dirty, and I didn't want to start a fire that I couldn't control. I arranged my supplies neatly, wanting everything to have its place. Even in isolation, I wanted a sense of order. I ate a quick meal of canned beans warmed over the stove and drank water from the creek after filtering it carefully. The first night was quiet, peaceful almost, and the sounds of the forest at night, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant birds, the occasional snap of a branch, felt soothing. I went to sleep feeling strangely calm. The next morning, I woke early, as I often do when away from artificial lights. The sunlight filtered through the trees in long streaks, making the cabin's interior glow softly. I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was thick, with tangled underbrush and towering trees. The air was damp, filled with the scent of earth and pine, and I noticed immediately that the forest was alive with sound. Birds, insects, and the occasional small animal scurrying through the undergrowth created a constant hum of life. I wandered for several hours, keeping track of landmarks, marking my path mentally. I wanted to be careful. It would be easy to get lost in these woods, especially as the trails were not clearly defined. The creek that ran near the cabin was small but clear, with smooth stones lining its bed, and I followed it for a short distance, finding that it curved back toward the cabin eventually. That evening, after returning, I built a small fire outside, just a circle of stones with dry wood I had gathered. The flames flickered against the darkness, and I felt a sense of satisfaction at the simple act. I cooked another meal, warming canned vegetables and a bit of pre-cooked rice, then sat and watched the fire until it died down to embers. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear, and it was at that moment, sitting alone with only the forest for company, that I first felt it. A sense of unease. Something about the forest felt heavier than it had during the day. The sounds that had been comforting now seemed sharper, closer, almost deliberate. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the quiet, the isolation amplifying ordinary noises. The second night, however, confirmed that instinctive unease. Around 2 a.m, I was awakened by a sound outside. At first, I thought it was a deer, perhaps a raccoon. But the noise was irregular, deliberate, something scraping against the cabin's outer wall. My heart rate quickened. I sat up quietly, listening. The cabin creaked as the wind passed through, but this was different. There was a soft, intermittent thumping, almost like someone or something was pacing just outside. I did not have a firearm, only the knife and the fire for protection, and I realized how vulnerable I was. I stayed still for a long time, straining to hear anything further. The sounds eventually stopped, leaving only the forest's normal night noises. I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, perhaps a large bird or a raccoon, but there was a tension I could not shake. Sleep eventually came, fitful and filled with dreams of shadows moving just beyond my vision. The next day, I was cautious. I inspected the cabin's perimeter, checking for signs of entry or disturbance. There was none. No footprints, no claw marks, nothing obvious. The forest seemed normal, quiet, and the creek ran clear as ever. Still, my sense of unease lingered. I decided to spend the day close to the cabin, gathering more firewood and exploring the immediate surroundings only. I noticed details I had missed the day before. Small trails that animals used, broken twigs along certain paths, the way the sunlight glinted off wet leaves. Everything seemed benign, ordinary, but the memory of the night's noises kept me alert. When I walked, I moved quietly, paying attention to every sound, every movement in the brush. By evening, I was exhausted, the constant vigilance taking a toll. I lit the cabin stove and ate dinner quickly, then sat by the window, watching shadows lengthen and the forest darken. The sky was overcast, and the first hints of a storm moved in, the wind rising and rustling the trees more violently than before. That night, the unease returned with a vengeance. The storm had settled into a low, persistent wind that shook the cabin walls. Rain began to patter against the roof, sometimes sharply, sometimes softly. Around midnight, the sound of scraping returned, louder this time, accompanied by a series of soft, deliberate knocks against the wood. My heart raced, and I gripped my knife tightly. I stayed still, listening, trying to locate the source, but the noise moved. It was circling the cabin, shifting from one side to the other. I realized immediately, whatever it wasn't random. It was aware of the cabin, aware of me. My rational mind tried to reason it out. Maybe an animal, maybe wind and falling branches, but deep down, I knew this was not ordinary. I sat for hours, not moving, barely breathing, waiting for the noise to stop. The rain increased, and eventually the storm drowned out everything else. Exhausted, I curled up on the floor with my knife and blankets, listening to the wind lash against the walls, the occasional tree branch scraping against the roof. Sleep came eventually, heavy and shallow. The next morning, I woke to find that the storm had left the forest littered with fallen branches and leaves. I stepped outside, assessing the damage, and realized that the sounds from the night before could have been a large animal, displaced by the storm. It was a rational explanation, and I clung to it desperately. I decided to explore slightly further from the cabin, keeping a careful eye on my surroundings. The forest seemed different after the storm. Paths were blocked, the ground was slick with mud, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. I moved slowly, marking my route with small ribbons of tape I had brought, careful not to get disoriented. The further I went, the more I felt that the forest itself was observing, that each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, was magnified in my mind. It was exhausting. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, drenched, tired, and slightly shaken, but relieved to be back in the relative safety of the wooden walls. Over the next several days, a routine developed. I ventured out cautiously, collected firewood, gathered food from the small creek, and spent hours observing the forest. I became acutely aware of the patterns of animal movement, the sound of birds, the flow of the creek. I kept my knife within reach at all times. I checked the cabin's perimeter daily, reinforcing weak spots and making sure that nothing could approach unnoticed. Despite this, the feeling of being watched never fully dissipated. Shadows seemed to linger just beyond my vision, and the faintest noises caused my heart to jump. One evening, I noticed large footprints in the mud near the cabin. They were too big to be a human's, and their shape suggested a large bear or another sizable animal. I froze, tracing the path of the prints. They circled the cabin, sometimes coming close, sometimes retreating, never going directly away. It dawned on me that whatever it was had been aware of my presence the entire time. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin was far out in the northern woods, near a small lake, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I had packed my car with supplies carefully, checking and rechecking everything. Food, water, clothes, first aid, tools, a small generator, firewood, and even extra batteries for my flashlight. I had mapped out the route from the nearest town, which was still an hour away by car, and I made sure to have offline maps on my phone, although I knew service would be spotty, maybe non-existent. I told myself it would be fine. I was capable, prepared, careful. Still, I could feel a slight nervous flutter in my stomach as I drove down the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, the trees gradually thickening on either side. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as described in the rental listing. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep metal roof, a stone chimney, and a front porch that had clearly seen better days. The surrounding forest was dense, with tall pines that blocked much of the sky and made the light uneven, casting shadows that seemed too dark for this early afternoon. I parked and stepped out, feeling the familiar crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The air smelled damp and earthy, like moss and rotting leaves mixed with the sharp scent of pine. I carried my bags up the narrow porch steps, noting the uneven boards that creaked under my weight. The door was heavy but functional, opening to reveal a small, dim interior with a wood stove, a couple of rickety chairs, and a table that looked like it had been homemade. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing. I placed my food in the small kitchen area, set up my bedding in the corner that served as a bedroom, and stacked firewood near the stove. The cabin had a small, musty smell, probably from disuse, but I found it comforting rather than off-putting. The windows were small and dirty, filtering the outside light into a dull, muted glow. I made sure all doors and windows were locked. Though I didn't expect anyone to come out here, the isolation always made me cautious. Once everything was arranged, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a small path leading from the cabin to the lake, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The usual sounds of civilization, the distant hum of traffic, dogs barking, people shouting, were completely absent. Even the forest had a peculiar stillness. I walked down the path, the tall grass brushing against my legs, and reached the water. The lake was calm, almost unnervingly so, reflecting the overcast sky. Small ripples occasionally disturbed its surface, caused by fish or insects, but it seemed almost too quiet, as though the water itself were holding its breath. I took a few photographs with my phone, then sat on a large rock at the water's edge, enjoying the silence. As the afternoon progressed, I returned to the cabin to start a fire. I struck matches until one caught, and the fire slowly built, filling the cabin with warmth and a flickering orange glow. I cooked a simple meal of pasta and canned vegetables, ate slowly, and cleaned up carefully afterward. Night fell sooner than I expected, and with it came a darkness that was thicker than I had anticipated. The cabin's windows let in almost no light, and I had to rely entirely on my flashlight and the fire to see. I went outside for a moment, stepping onto the porch. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the treetops and sending shivers down my spine. I could hear small animals moving through the underbrush, the soft crackle of twigs, the distant splash of a fish jumping in the lake. Everything felt normal, yet the isolation weighed on me. I went back inside, shut the door, and double-checked the locks. I decided to get an early night, hoping sleep would help calm the tension that had started to build in my chest. I woke several times during the night. At first, it was nothing more than the usual sounds of the forest. The occasional snap of a branch, the distant cry of an owl, the wind against the roof. But as the hours passed, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. There were sounds that seemed too deliberate, like footsteps crunching leaves or twigs just outside the cabin. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been alone for long stretches before, and the mind tends to invent threats in total silence. But these sounds were different. They were deliberate, moving around the cabin in ways that made my stomach knot. By dawn, I was exhausted but too restless to sleep further. I prepared a small breakfast, sat at the table, and tried to shake off the unease. When I looked outside, I noticed something strange. There were broken twigs and small depressions in the ground near the edge of the trees surrounding the cabin. They didn't match the patterns of deer tracks or any normal animal activity I was familiar with. My heart began to race. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. I tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe some local kids had wandered this far. Maybe an animal had disturbed the underbrush. But something in me refused to be entirely reassured. That morning, I decided to explore a little further to distract myself. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush became thick, forcing me to step carefully. The deeper I went, the more I noticed subtle signs of recent activity. Broken branches, trampled grass, and even footprints that didn't match my own. They were human-sized, but the shapes were too distorted to tell if they were made by shoes or boots. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was probably a hiker or a hunter who had passed through. But the further I walked, the more the feeling of being watched grew. A pressure at the back of my neck and the base of my skull that I could not ignore. By mid-morning, I had reached a small clearing. It was a beautiful spot, with sunlight filtering through the treetops and a patch of wildflowers. I paused to rest, thinking maybe I could calm my nerves. That's when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible snapping sound behind me. I froze, listening. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. Then, soft but deliberate, there were footsteps, moving closer. Not the erratic steps of an animal, but careful, slow human steps. My pulse quickened, and I realized I hadn't seen another person all morning. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I backtracked quickly, trying to follow the trail that would take me back to the cabin, moving faster than I would normally in such terrain. When I returned, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. My cabin door, which I had locked tightly the night before, was slightly ajar. My first thought was that I had been careless, but then I remembered locking it myself. I approached cautiously, keeping my flashlight in hand. The inside of the cabin was just as I had left it, but small details immediately unsettled me. My firewood stack had been disturbed slightly. There were faint scuff marks on the floor near the door. Nothing was missing, nothing seemed overtly wrong, but the implication was clear. Someone had been here. I spent the next several hours examining the area around the cabin, looking for clues, signs of recent passage. Every broken branch, every footprint, and every misplaced object seemed to confirm my growing fear. Someone had been stalking the cabin. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I had no cell service to call for help, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but then I realized that moving in panic could be dangerous. The forest was dense, and if someone was following me, I could easily get lost or cornered. I needed a plan. I decided to reinforce the cabin as best as I could. I moved heavy furniture in front of the doors and windows, stacked extra firewood along the entrance, and set up a makeshift alarm using cans and string, something I had learned about from a survival guide. I didn't know if it would help, but it was better than nothing. The day passed slowly, with me constantly scanning the forest from inside the cabin. Every rustle, every shadow made my heart leap. I didn't allow myself to relax. Night came again, and with it, the oppressive darkness. I kept the fire going and stayed near the door, listening. Hours passed. At one point, I thought I heard movement outside, faint and deliberate, but it could have been a deer or some other animal. I didn't take any chances. I stayed awake all night, exhausted, gripping a heavy stick I had found outside, ready to defend myself. When dawn finally arrived, I could barely keep my eyes open, but the relief of seeing sunlight was overwhelming. I didn't know if my visitor had left or was still hiding in the woods. I knew I needed to get out and reach help. I packed essential supplies, food, water, my first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone, which had only one bar of service now and then. I left a note inside the cabin explaining where I was going, just in case. Then I set off along the main path, sticking to open areas where I could see potential threats. I moved as quickly as I could without making unnecessary noise. About an hour into my hike toward the nearest road, I saw a pair of figures at the edge of the trees, watching me. I froze, but then they I had been planning the trip for months, wanting nothing more than a few days completely alone in the woods, far from the noise of the city and the people who never seemed to stop talking, always moving, always asking for something. The cabin I rented was tucked deep into a forest I barely knew, accessible by a single, narrow dirt road that twisted through pines and maples, the trees so thick in some places that sunlight barely touched the ground. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already low, spilling an orange light through the branches. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, and the quiet was the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, almost tangible. I carried my backpack to the cabin, a small, rustic structure with weathered wood siding, a tin roof, and a stone chimney. There was no electricity, no internet, no cell signal for miles, and I had wanted all of that. I wanted nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch beneath an animal's foot. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. Dust lay in thin layers on the floors and counters, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed in a corner with a thin mattress. A wood-burning stove sat against one wall, blackened by years of use. I set my things down and began to explore the space, opening drawers and cabinets, making mental notes of what I would need to keep safe or repair. The windows offered views of the forest in every direction, trees pressing close to the cabin, their shadows stretching long in the dying sunlight. I spent the first hour preparing the stove and gathering some firewood from a small pile near the back door. The cold had already begun to seep into the cabin, and I liked the warmth of the fire almost immediately. As the flames flickered, I noticed that every sound outside seemed sharper. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft crunch of some small animal moving over fallen branches. I felt a thrill of isolation, the way the cabin seemed to exist entirely on its own, disconnected from the world. Night fell quickly. I ate a simple meal, then sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the darkness outside became complete. The forest became a wall of black, trees indistinguishable from one another, and I realized that even though I was alone, I was not unseen. Every sound carried, and every movement felt magnified. A branch snapped sharply somewhere to the left, and I froze, heart racing. I told myself it was a deer, a raccoon, or a fox, but the sound lingered in my mind. Another snap, this one closer, made me grab the flashlight from the table and shine it out the nearest window. Nothing, only darkness and shadowed trunks. I tried to sleep, but the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the walls. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing the rhythm of the storm outside. Rain began, heavy and insistent, drumming on the tin roof. It created a constant noise that was both soothing and oppressive. Sleep came in fits, broken by the occasional gust that made the cabin groan and shudder. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. A deliberate knock on the door. Not the kind of tap made by a branch falling or a small animal, but a solid human knock, slow and measured. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to breathe steadily. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I had told no one where I was. I didn't move at first. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the storm, a branch caught in the siding, but I knew the difference. I gripped the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door, peering through the small window beside it. Nothing, only darkness. I waited, every nerve on edge. Another knock, louder this time, reverberated through the wood. I realized that whatever it was, it knew I was inside. Panic surged. I remembered the small axe I had brought, leaning it against the wall near the bed. I considered calling out, but no words would reach anyone. My options were limited. Stay inside and hope, or confront whoever it was. I fumbled for the lock, making sure it was secure, then backed away, listening. Footsteps moved around the cabin, deliberate and slow. I could hear the crunch of wet leaves and mud beneath shoes. My mind raced through every possible scenario. A hiker lost in the storm, a hunter looking for shelter, someone with far worse intentions. Hours passed like this, the rain relentless, the wind howling, and the footsteps circling. I stayed close to the fire, clutching the axe, every sense straining for the faintest clue. Finally, in the early hours before dawn, the noises stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rain and the creaking of the cabin. Exhausted, I stayed awake, staring at the windows until the sky lightened slightly with the first hints of day. When I finally dared to look outside, I saw footprints in the mud surrounding the cabin, large and deliberate, circling the structure before heading back into the trees. Whoever it was had come close enough to see me, to make me fear for my life, and then left without a trace. The next morning, I packed my things quickly. I didn't eat or make coffee. I felt exposed and vulnerable, the safety I had imagined in the cabin gone. I kept the axe in my hand as I loaded my backpack into the car, constantly scanning the tree line. Once on the dirt road, I drove slowly, watching every shadow, every movement. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where the world felt normal and people moved in predictable ways. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the footprints and the knocking, but they could only record it. No one was found, no evidence remained. It took me weeks to stop imagining someone lurking outside, just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. The cabin, which had seemed like a refuge, had become a reminder of how fragile safety really was. I never went back. I told myself I had learned something crucial. Isolation in the wilderness is dangerous not because of wild animals or the forest itself, but because of other people. I had underestimated that, and I would never make the same mistake again. In the end, I returned to my life in the city, carrying the lesson that fear is not always a story or a shadow, but sometimes the real, solid presence of someone else, someone unknown, in the dark. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The idea of getting away from the city, the noise, the endless traffic, and the constant hum of people's lives pressing in on me had grown into an almost desperate need. I had found a cabin listed online, a small, isolated place deep in the woods near a lake about 3 hours outside the city. The pictures made it look rustic but safe, sturdy in the way only well-maintained wood and stone can be, with a fire pit outside and a small dock leading into the water. I liked the simplicity of it, the promise of solitude, and the chance to be completely on my own for a few days. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had all the essentials: food, water, blankets, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and some basic tools. I also packed a few books and a notebook, though I knew I might never open them. I wanted to be alone, but I also knew the quiet could make your mind start to wander in ways it never did in the city. The drive was long but peaceful. The city slowly dissolved into suburban neighborhoods, then into rolling hills, and finally into stretches of road flanked by dense forest. I could feel the stress I had been carrying seep out of me with each mile. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road. The dirt path leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, lined with high grass and low branches that brushed against my car as I drove. The GPS had given me exact directions, but the road felt like it belonged more to someone's memory than to any modern map. It twisted and turned, going up hills and down into small valleys, until finally the trees parted slightly, and I could see the cabin ahead. It was even more isolated than I had imagined. No other houses were visible, only the lake behind it, which reflected the evening light like a sheet of dark glass. The cabin itself was modest, a single story with a small porch and windows that looked out over the water. A stack of firewood sat neatly by the side, and the smell of pine and damp earth hung in the air. I parked my car on a small patch of flattened grass and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a quiet room in the city, where the hum of distant traffic and the occasional dog bark make it alive. This was the kind of silence that feels like a weight, dense and tangible, pressing in from every direction. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off a sudden, uncharacteristic shiver, and started unloading my things. The interior of the cabin was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen area, a living room with a sofa and a couple of chairs, and a lofted bedroom above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and I could tell it had been used recently by the smell of ash and wood smoke. Everything seemed in place, almost pristine, like someone had cleaned meticulously before I arrived. I set my things down, lit a small lamp, and decided to explore the surrounding area before it got too dark. I wanted to get a sense of the land, the forest, the lake, and the paths that might lead somewhere. I took my flashlight and stepped outside, the cool air making me pull my jacket tighter around me. The woods were dense, the trees close together, and the undergrowth thick. The ground was uneven, full of roots and fallen branches. The light from the fading sun made long streaks between the trunks, but there were already dark patches where the trees blocked everything. I followed a narrow path that led from the cabin into the woods, moving cautiously. I wasn't afraid of animals, at least not consciously, but I could feel a tension building in my chest, a quiet awareness that I was completely alone here, that no one would know where I was if something went wrong. I walked for maybe half an hour before turning back. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the trees, leaving only a dim glow in the sky. The shadows in the forest were deep now, and I felt them pressing against me from all sides as I made my way back. When I returned to the cabin, I decided to light the fireplace. There was a sense of comfort in the crackling fire, the warmth and flickering light pushing back the darkness outside. I ate a simple dinner, bread and cheese, washed it down with water, and then sat on the sofa, staring into the fire. The quiet was complete. Not a sound of cars, not a distant dog, nothing. Only the occasional call of a bird, a far-off splash from the lake, or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Night came fully, and the darkness outside became almost suffocating. I kept the lights low, the fire burning, but there was a constant sense of being watched, of the forest pressing against the cabin. At first, it was just the natural awareness that comes from being alone in a strange place. But as the hours passed, the feeling deepened. I heard noises, soft ones at first, like twigs snapping or small animals moving through the underbrush. Then, there were heavier sounds, more deliberate, steps that seemed closer, not like a deer or a raccoon, but something bigger. My heart started to pound. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked, the structure solid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, that someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of my firelight. Sleep came fitfully. I woke repeatedly, drawn awake by noises outside. Each time, I strained my ears, listening to the darkness, hearing branches snapping, leaves rustling, shadows shifting. At some point, I realized that the sounds were not random. They had a rhythm, a pattern, moving closer and then further away. My mind raced, trying to explain it logically. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe some people had come to this remote place, maybe I had just misheard something. But every time I calmed myself down, the sound would come again, louder, closer, more deliberate. The next morning, I decided to stay inside until the sun rose fully. I packed some water and food in case I needed to leave quickly. The sun climbed higher, but the forest still seemed impenetrable, thick with shadows. I tried to convince myself to go out and explore, to look for any rational explanation for the noises. But the thought of stepping outside, of moving through the trees while someone might be watching, made my stomach tighten. I decided to stay in the cabin, to barricade the doors as much as possible, and to remain alert. By late morning, I forced myself to leave. I moved cautiously, checking the perimeter, scanning the forest for signs of human presence. At first, I saw nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of a campsite, no discarded items. But then I noticed broken branches along the path I had walked the day before, marks that didn't look like normal forest debris. I followed them, keeping close to the cabin, my eyes constantly moving, trying to catch a glimpse of anyone. That's when I saw it. A figure, partially hidden behind a tree, watching me. It was quick to move, ducking out of sight as soon as I raised my hand to wave. My heart raced. I realized then that the sounds at night were not animals. They had been a person or people moving through the forest. I ran back to the cabin, my mind spinning. I double-checked all the locks, looked out the windows, trying to see any movement. The figure was gone, but the unease remained. I considered calling the police, but the cell service was spotty at best. I had to make a plan. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I moved furniture to block doors, created makeshift alarms by tying cans to strings that would clatter if disturbed, and kept a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife nearby. I stayed near the fire, keeping it burning bright, the light casting long shadows and making the cabin feel more like a fortress than a home. Night came again, and with it, the noises. This time, I was ready. I could hear the steps, deliberate and heavy, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping as if the person were watching, listening. My hands were steady but tense, ready to defend myself. Hours passed like this, the darkness pressing in, the figure moving outside. I stayed awake, never closing my eyes, never letting my guard down. Eventually, the noises faded as dawn approached. The forest lightened, shadows retreating, revealing the trees and the path. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside again. What I saw made my stomach twist. Footprints surrounded the cabin, some very recent, pressed deeply into the dirt and soft ground. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and marks on the porch indicated someone had been there, close enough to touch the doors and windows. I realized that this was not random. Someone had been watching me, perhaps for hours, maybe for days. I made a decision to leave immediately. I packed my things quickly but carefully, keeping my eyes on the forest the entire time. As I drove away, I could see figures moving among the trees in the distance, retreating as I accelerated down the dirt path. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the paved surface of civilization feeling almost unreal after the isolation. Back in the city, I reported the incident. Police officers visited the cabin, taking photographs and tracking footprints, but by then, the people had vanished. They found I remember the day I left for the cabin as if it were etched in my mind in crisp detail. It was a late autumn morning, and the sky was a pale gray, layered with thick clouds that made the air feel heavy. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week of solitude, a break from the constant noise and pressure of life in the city. The cabin itself was small and isolated, tucked deep in the forest miles away from the nearest road. I had found it through an online listing that promised privacy, a rustic charm, and a chance to reconnect with nature. I told myself that alone in the woods would be peaceful, maybe even healing. The drive there was long, taking nearly 6 hours. The road narrowed as I left the highway, transforming from asphalt to gravel, then dirt, and finally a narrow, twisting track that disappeared into the thick trees. The forest seemed dense and dark, the kind of place where even the daylight barely penetrated the canopy. I noticed the stillness immediately, the way the air felt heavier, the lack of human sound, the sudden dominance of wind through leaves, snapping branches, and distant bird calls that seemed too far away. It was beautiful, but it carried a quiet tension, an unspoken sense of isolation that I couldn't shake. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was as the photos had shown. A simple, one-story wooden structure with a small porch, a chimney, and windows that reflected the gray sky. The exterior smelled of aged pine and damp earth, and the wood creaked slightly as I walked on the porch. The surrounding land was uneven, a clearing surrounded by towering trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and took a long, deep breath. I felt a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. The inside of the cabin was sparse but functional. A small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, a modest table, and a couple of chairs. There was one bedroom with a simple bed, and the bathroom was equipped with basic plumbing. Everything smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. I spent the first hour unpacking, arranging my things, and taking stock of supplies. I had brought enough food, water, and firewood to last the week, along with a flashlight, extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. I told myself repeatedly that I was prepared, but a small voice in my mind whispered that preparation only mattered so much when you were completely alone in the middle of nowhere. I decided to start a fire in the stove. The fire was small at first, sputtering, but gradually it grew, filling the room with warmth and light. I sat on the floor near it, stretching my legs and staring at the flickering flames. Outside, the forest seemed to press against the cabin, the wind rattling the windows and making the trees groan. Shadows moved in strange ways as the branches swayed. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but every so often, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, as if something unseen was watching. The first night was uncomfortable. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal, and tried to focus on my breathing. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by moments when I felt compelled to sit up and scan the darkened room. At some point, I heard something outside, a faint crunching sound, as if someone or something was moving just beyond the clearing. My heart raced, and I gripped the edge of the blanket, straining to hear. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped, leaving only the wind. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, and eventually, exhaustion pulled me into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, with fallen leaves covering the ground, making each step soft and muffled. I marked my path carefully, aware that getting lost here would be a serious risk. The more I walked, the more I noticed the isolation, the sheer distance from roads, the lack of human structures, the way every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. Birds moved through the trees in sudden flocks, their wings brushing the air loudly. Somewhere nearby, water flowed, and I followed the sound to a small stream cutting through the forest. The water was cold and clear, and I knelt to drink some, feeling the sharp chill of it on my hands. The forest seemed peaceful during the day, but I could still feel an underlying tension, a reminder that I was alone and far from help. By the second night, the unease had grown. I had noticed strange details during the day, broken branches along a trail I had taken, fresh animal tracks that didn't match anything I recognized, and faint indentations in the mud that looked like footprints. Nothing concrete, nothing threatening, but enough to keep me on edge. That evening, I lit the fire again and sat close, scanning the dark windows with the flashlight I kept at hand. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned more violently, making long, hollow sounds. I tried to eat a simple dinner, but the food felt heavy in my stomach, my mind occupied with thoughts of what could be lurking in the dark beyond the cabin walls. Around midnight, the first real scare happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a sudden, sharp knock on the cabin door. My body froze. It wasn't a timid tap or the wind rattling the wood. It was deliberate, a loud, solid knock that echoed through the small room. My heart raced, and I grabbed the flashlight, crawling slowly to the door. Outside, nothing moved. The trees swayed in the wind, but the clearing was empty. I checked the perimeter of the cabin with the flashlight, walking slowly and making deliberate noises to let any animal know I was there. There was nothing, not even a disturbed patch of leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat near the stove, listening for hours, my mind racing with possibilities. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound had been too precise, too forceful for that. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found the first real sign that something was wrong. The firewood I had stacked neatly outside had been disturbed. Logs were moved, some broken, and there were marks in the dirt near the pile that looked like they had been made by boots. I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't seen anyone during my hike the day before, and the nearest road was miles away. Someone could not have been here without my noticing them earlier. I checked the cabin for signs of forced entry, but everything was intact. The door was locked, the windows secure. Still, the sense of being watched, of intrusion, was undeniable. Over the next 2 days, I became increasingly hyper-aware of every sound, every movement outside. I saw fleeting shadows through the windows, shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I began barricading the door with a chair and stacking extra firewood near the windows, a primitive attempt to create security. I explored the surrounding forest cautiously, moving only during the day and staying close to the cabin. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt through me. My food supply was sufficient, but the mental strain was heavy. I kept imagining scenarios. A lost hiker, a trespasser, someone hunting, someone with malicious intent. The isolation magnified every fear. On the 4th night, the real danger became evident. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from the constant vigilance, when I heard it. Footsteps around the cabin, deliberate, slow, careful. Someone was walking in the clearing. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed a small hunting knife I had packed and crouched near the door, listening. The steps circled the cabin, pausing at each window. The sound was methodical, intentional. I dared not move or make a sound. My mind raced through every possible escape, every option for survival. I thought about climbing out the back window, about running into the forest, but I knew the forest offered no safety in the dark. I could hide inside, but if someone tried to break in, I was alone, vulnerable, and defenseless. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The footsteps eventually receded, fading into the distance, leaving the cabin silent but charged with tension. I did not sleep again that night. When morning finally came, I ventured outside carefully. There were clear footprints, large, booted prints circling the cabin. They were fresh, pressed into the mud, and unmistakable. Whoever had been there was still around, and they had been deliberately observing me. I knew then that this was no animal, no accident, no wandering hiker. This was a human, someone with the intention or at least the curiosity to enter my space. I felt the weight of my vulnerability, the real danger of being alone in this isolated place. The following day, I spent the entire daylight hours preparing. I fortified the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood near the windows, ensuring the door was locked and reinforced, and moving sharp tools within easy reach. I also packed my bag with essentials: food, water, first aid, flashlight, and knife, ready to leave at a moment's notice. I stayed near the windows, watching, listening, and trying to convince myself that the day would pass with. I had been planning the trip for months, making a checklist, researching cabins, reading online reviews, and double-checking maps. I wanted to get away from everything. The constant noise of the city, the endless notifications, the suffocating pressure of deadlines. The idea was simple. 1 week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No internet, no phone signal, just me and the silence. I picked a small cabin in a remote area, far from any main roads, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt path that the GPS warned might be difficult to traverse in bad weather. The pictures online looked perfect. A wooden cabin, isolated, surrounded by dense forest, with a small creek running nearby. I imagined sitting on the porch in the morning, listening to the birds, walking down to the creek with a coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. I packed my car carefully, leaving no unnecessary items behind. I made sure to bring extra food, water, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and batteries. I even packed a small hatchet and a folding shovel just in case. I thought I was prepared for anything. I left the city on a Friday morning, the sun bright, the roads clear, feeling a mix of excitement and relief. The drive itself was peaceful at first. The further I went, the narrower and rougher the road became, eventually turning into a single lane of dirt and gravel. Every mile deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker and colder, and the trees grew closer together, creating long stretches of shadow across the path. I felt a twinge of unease, a tiny knot in my stomach, but I told myself it was normal. Just the isolation, just my imagination. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a sense of satisfaction and relief. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine and oak trees, with a thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney, though no one was there. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, with wooden walls darkened from years of weather, a stone foundation, and a simple porch with a rocking chair and a stack of firewood neatly piled on one side. I parked my car, stepped out, and stretched, feeling the crisp air on my skin. I remember thinking how quiet it was. So quiet that every sound, the wind rustling through leaves, a distant bird call, even my own breathing, felt amplified. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood and dampness. There was a small living room with a wood stove, a kitchen area with basic utensils, a table and chairs, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything was functional, nothing fancy. I unpacked my belongings, set up my sleeping area, and lit a fire in the stove, feeling a small warmth spread through the room. By the time evening came, the sky had darkened completely, leaving only the dim glow of the fire to light the cabin. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and for the first time, I felt genuinely alone. It wasn't scary yet, just unfamiliar, and that made me alert. I ate a simple dinner, made coffee, and sat on the porch for a while, looking at the creek. The sound of running water was oddly comforting, rhythmic, steady. I could hear something moving in the trees occasionally. A branch breaking, the scurry of small animals, but it was distant and natural. I told myself I was just hearing what I expected to hear, letting my imagination shape ordinary noises into something more dramatic. I went to bed early, expecting a good night's sleep. But night in the woods is nothing like night in the city. The darkness was heavy, almost physical, pressing against the windows. The wind grew stronger, rattling the cabin's shutters. I lay awake for hours, listening, trying to pinpoint every sound. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint, irregular noise coming from outside, like the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze. It was too irregular to be an animal and too deliberate to be a branch falling. I sat very still, holding my breath. The sound stopped, then began again, closer this time, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities. Another hiker lost in the woods? Someone else with bad intentions? I reminded myself that the cabin was off any main road, secluded, and no one else would likely be here. And yet, the sound persisted. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly opened the front door, shining the beam around the clearing. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees black against the night sky. I saw nothing. No footprints, no movement, nothing but shadows. Still, the noise didn't stop completely. It was faint now, but it felt like it was circling me, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. My heart pounded. My hands trembled. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. I considered going back inside and locking the door, but then I remembered I had left the kitchen window slightly open to air out the cabin. That small detail now filled me with dread. Whoever or whatever was outside could have entered. I grabbed the hatchet from where I had placed it by the stove and slowly checked each room. Everything seemed untouched, no sign of intrusion. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. Maybe I had imagined it. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Every crack of wood, every rustle outside made me jump. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The sunlight made the forest less intimidating, but the knots in my stomach were still there. I walked around the cabin, inspecting the ground. That's when I saw them. Faint footprints in the soft soil around the cabin, partially washed away by the morning dew, but still visible. Human footprints. They weren't recent enough to be last night's. They seemed older, but I had no way of knowing how old. My pulse quickened. Whoever had been here before me, maybe someone living in these woods, was now a possibility I could no longer ignore. I spent the day trying to convince myself to stay, to enjoy the solitude as planned. I hiked a little around the surrounding area, taking mental notes of landmarks, the creek, the slope of the land, the density of the trees. The isolation was beautiful during the day. Birds chirped, the creek babbled, sunlight dappled through the trees, and for a while, I almost forgot the unease of the night. I cooked dinner, made a fire, and settled in. But as night fell again, the silence returned. The wind picked up, stronger this time, and the noises outside started again. Small snaps, shuffles, the faint impression of movement. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The sense of being watched, stalked even without proof. This time, I didn't go to bed. I stayed awake, flashlight and hatchet in hand, scanning the darkness through the windows. Hours passed. I noticed something I hadn't before. The forest around the cabin seemed unnaturally still at times, like someone was stopping all movement to watch. The air felt charged, heavy with tension. I had never felt fear so intense in my life. My mind raced with scenarios. What if someone had followed me? What if they were still out there? What if they were watching from the treeline? The uncertainty was unbearable. By the third night, I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait, paralyzed by fear. I decided to hike back to the nearest main road, about 5 miles away, to get help, supplies, or at least contact. I packed my things, left some notes in the cabin just in case, and set off just after midnight, hoping the cover of darkness and the quiet of the woods would keep me safe. The trail was difficult in the dark. Roots and rocks threatened to trip me at every step, branches clawed at my clothes, and the sounds of the forest were constant, sometimes reassuring, sometimes alarming. I kept the flashlight focused ahead, moving slowly, deliberately, listening for any sign of movement behind me. About 2 miles in, I heard it, footsteps again. Behind me on the trail, closer now, deliberate, matching my pace. I froze, heart hammering, then kept walking, trying to stay calm, imagining maybe it was another hiker or a ranger. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I broke into a faster walk, then a run, hoping to put distance between me and whoever or whatever was following. The sounds kept pace with me, sometimes matching, sometimes slower, but always present. My legs burned, lungs ached, sweat stung my eyes, but I couldn't stop. I reached a clearing where the moonlight broke through, illuminating a faint dirt road that connected to the main road. Relief flooded me, but I kept running until I saw the first headlights in the distance. I waved frantically, screaming. The car slowed, then stopped. A man stepped out, startled, asking what was wrong. I explained, panting and gasping, about the cabin, the footsteps, the woods. He offered to drive me to the nearest ranger station. Back in the safety of civilization, the fear finally started to ebb, replaced by exhaustion. I realized the full scope of what had happened. Alone in that remote cabin, I had been completely exposed, vulnerable. I didn't mean to end up here. Really, I didn't. But when things fall apart, you don't always have the luxury of choosing your escape. It all started a few weeks ago when my life seemed to crumble, piece by piece. First, my job, then the apartment. I guess you could say I was running from everything, but in truth, I was just looking for somewhere to breathe again. So I found a cabin in the woods, isolated, quiet, no one around for miles. When I first arrived, the place seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. The forest around the cabin was dense, tall trees stretching up into the sky like silent watchers. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, with the scent of pine and earth. I could hear the birds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch from some unseen animal. It was all so perfect in its simplicity. The cabin itself was small, but sturdy, tucked away at the edge of the forest, with a small porch that overlooked a shallow stream. Felt like a dream. I made my way inside. The door creaked open with the softest sound, almost like it was welcoming me. The interior was exactly what I expected, old but functional. A wooden floor with a faded rug near the hearth, a rocking chair by the window, and a small kitchen that had everything I needed. There was a small bedroom with a bed covered in an old quilt, and a large stone fireplace that had clearly seen many winters. I unpacked quickly, setting up a small fire in the hearth, and then sat in the rocking chair by the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It felt like time had slowed down here, as if the cabin existed in a place outside of reality. But that peace didn't last. The first night, I slept soundly, too soundly. Something about the stillness of the woods made me restless in a way I couldn't explain. I woke up around 3 a.m., feeling an overwhelming sense of unease. The air in the cabin was thick, almost stifling, and the silence was too much, too complete. I thought I heard something in the distance, a faint crackling, like twigs snapping underfoot. But when I listened harder, it stopped. I convinced myself it was just a deer or something else. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered. The next morning, I went out for a walk to shake off the bad feeling. The sun was up, the forest was alive with chirping birds and the sound of rustling leaves. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt off. The trees were too dense, the underbrush too thick. It was hard to see beyond a few feet into the forest. Still, I pressed on. The stream was only a short walk away, and I needed the distraction. I found it quickly, the water clear and cold, flowing over smooth rocks. I knelt down to splash my face, the chill waking me up fully. As I stood up, I noticed something odd. A trail of footprints leading into the woods. They were fresh, the earth soft from last night's rain, and they were large. Too large for a normal animal. They didn't look like human tracks, but something between. I thought about it for a moment, but then I shook it off. It was probably just some weird animal I didn't know about. I spent the rest of the day trying to forget the tracks, telling myself I was just imagining things. But that night, the unease returned. This time, I was awake when I heard the noise. It started around midnight, a faint rustling outside the cabin. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was the wind or maybe an animal. But then it came again, louder, closer. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just outside. And that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing still, just at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, but the way they stood was wrong. Too still, too rigid. The figure didn't move, just stared back at me through the dark, the light catching something faintly reflective in its eyes. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I ducked down below the window, holding my breath. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and when I finally dared to look again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I didn't go far from the cabin. I felt like I was being watched, like the trees themselves were keeping secrets. The tracks from the day before were still there, but now they were more distinct, more real. They led away from the stream, deeper into the woods. That afternoon, I decided to head into town for supplies. I figured a trip to the store might calm my nerves. The town was small, barely more than a few buildings clustered together. The people there didn't seem particularly friendly, but they weren't unfriendly either. The old woman at the store seemed to know I wasn't from around there. "You staying at the cabin by the creek?" she asked, her eyes sharp. She didn't wait for an answer. "It's been empty for years. No one stays there long." I forced a smile, trying to brush it off, just looking for some peace and quiet. She gave me a look, like she saw right through my words. "You better be careful," she warned. "There are things in those woods that aren't meant to be found." Her words stuck with me all the way back to the cabin. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The thought of whatever was in the woods lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, even though the cabin felt like a prison. I slept with the light on, the soft crackling of the fire the only sound that kept the silence at bay. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, the idea of staying in that cabin any longer making my skin crawl. I loaded my car, slamming the trunk closed with a sense of finality. I drove out of the small gravel driveway, my eyes scanning the trees one last time, but the woods felt different now. They felt alive, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. That night, as I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time in the rearview mirror. The porch light flickered, casting a long, eerie shadow across the clearing. For the first time, I realized that the cabin hadn't been empty for years, and something had been watching me the entire time. had planned the trip for months, thinking about it almost every day. The idea was simple: a week alone in a remote cabin in the mountains, away from the noise in the city, away from everything that demanded attention. I was tired of my routine, tired of people, tired of myself. I had driven for hours, winding up through the twisting roads, watching the trees get taller, the air colder, and the sky clearer as I moved further into the wilderness. By the time I reached the cabin, I could feel the city behind me in a tangible way, like a shadow that had slowly shrunk to nothing. The cabin was small, a single story with weathered wooden boards, a stone chimney, and a porch that creaked under weight. It was exactly what I wanted: isolated, sturdy, and silent. The first night was surprisingly comfortable. I unpacked my supplies, stacked firewood, and lit the fireplace. The flames crackled and danced against the walls, and I felt a strange sense of pride. I had built a life of small routines: wake, cook, clean, walk outside, and then return to the warmth of the cabin. The first days passed quietly. I explored the surrounding forest, noting every detail: the way the sunlight cut through the trees, the sounds of distant birds, the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. At night, the forest seemed heavier. Shadows were thicker, the wind whispered differently. But I told myself I was imagining things. The wilderness is not gentle, I reminded myself. It does not care. On the fourth night, everything changed. I had gone into town earlier that day for supplies, fuel for the generator, extra food, batteries, and returned by late afternoon. By the time I got back, the sky was gray, and clouds had begun to roll in. The forest seemed darker than usual, the kind of dark that makes everything a silhouette, where shapes are not shapes and sound is muffled. I had planned to spend the evening chopping wood for the coming storm. The wind picked up as I started, bending the trees, rattling the cabin, and making the forest feel like it was moving in waves. I noticed it first when I heard a snap behind me, something sharp, quick, and deliberate. I froze. The forest was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the whistle of the wind, but this was different. It was a single snap, like someone breaking a branch. My first thought was animal. Bears, maybe, though I knew bears would not approach me in daylight. But I could not shake the feeling that it was too precise, too controlled to be random. I kept chopping, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, right near the treeline. I set the axe down slowly and looked toward the edge of the clearing. Shadows seemed to move unnaturally. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It felt like a living presence watching me. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it could be another hiker, a hunter, maybe even a deer. But the forest was too quiet for others to be out here now, and there were no paths nearby, just thick undergrowth. I decided to retreat into the cabin. Inside, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat by the fire. The wind outside was stronger now, slamming branches against the walls, rattling the roof. I could hear things moving, but it was impossible to tell exactly what. My mind raced. I had been careful, had brought food, water, a radio, and a first aid kit. I had a generator for electricity and extra batteries for the flashlight. I had done everything right. Still, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. The night was long. Every snap, every rustle made me jump. I could not sleep. Hours passed, and the storm outside grew worse. Rain battered the roof, wind bent the trees so low it seemed they might break, and somewhere in the distance, a deep groaning sound, like a tree struggling under pressure, filled the air. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I strained to see through the rain-streaked windows, but nothing was visible. I stayed awake, holding a heavy flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, telling myself that even if someone tried to break in, I was prepared. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the forest wet and dripping. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a pale, cold light across the clearing. I ventured outside, careful, scanning the edges of the forest. That was when I noticed something. Footprints, large, human-like, but not completely human. The heel and toe were odd, elongated. They led from the tree line to the porch, stopping right at the steps. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had been out there had come to the cabin, had stood at my door while I slept in the other room. The next days were unbearable. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my heart race. I could not relax. I moved through the cabin methodically, checking locks, boarding up windows, making sure nothing could get inside. I realized the forest itself had become a cage. The isolation I had once loved now felt like a trap. The wind, the trees, the sounds of animals, they all seemed hostile. Every rustle was amplified. I felt eyes on me constantly, though I could never see anyone. On the fifth night, the situation escalated. I was in the middle of cooking dinner when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking along the edge of the clearing. Slow, careful steps, deliberate. I froze, holding the pan in my hands. The sound circled the cabin, pausing occasionally, as if studying me. I turned off the stove, extinguished the fire, and sat in darkness, hoping the shadows would hide me. The steps continued until they stopped abruptly, right at the edge of the porch. I could hear breathing, deep, uneven, controlled. I wanted to call the authorities, but the cell signal was patchy at best. My radio only picked up static. Hours passed. I stayed crouched behind the couch, barely breathing, listening. Eventually, the footsteps receded, fading into the forest. I waited another hour before venturing to the windows. Nothing, just the wet forest, the bent trees, and the cold air. Sleep did not come that night. My mind was a constant whirl of fear, exhaustion, and confusion. I realized the situation was no longer manageable. I could not stay here. The plan formed in the morning. I needed to leave before nightfall. I packed quickly, stuffing essentials into my backpack. Food, water, flashlight, batteries, knife, and first aid kit. I left behind most of my things. I did not care about the cabin anymore. I could not stay there. The forest was no longer just wilderness. It was a threat, an unpredictable, intelligent presence. Every step toward my truck was tense. I scanned the treeline constantly. I did not want to know if anyone was out there. I only wanted the road. I reached the truck safely, surprisingly. The journey back down the mountain was tense but uneventful. Every shadow, every bend in the road, made me grip the wheel tighter. I dared not stop until I reached the first town. The moment I saw other people, cars, signs, I felt my tension start to melt. The city air, once suffocating, now felt like freedom. Looking back, I know what made those days so terrifying. It was not ghosts or legends or fairy tales. It was isolation, vulnerability, and the possibility that someone or something was watching, waiting, studying me. The wilderness itself is indifferent, but human beings are not. The footprints, the careful approach, the observation, all of it reminded me that danger does not have to be magical to be real. I was lucky. I survived because I recognized my limits and acted decisively. Since that trip, I have not returned to the mountains. I hike shorter trails, in groups, and I always make sure someone knows my exact route. The memory of that cabin, the dark forest, and the feeling of being watched remains vivid. I carry it with me, not as fear, but as respect, for nature, for isolation, and for the quiet, patient dangers that exist when you think you are completely alone. I remember the drive into the woods that morning like it was etched into my memory in slow motion. The sky was pale and gray, the kind of gray that seems endless and heavy, pressing down against the tops of the pines as I followed the gravel road that twisted through the mountains. I had never been to this cabin before, though I had rented it online for a week-long retreat, thinking I needed solitude and a break from the city. The ad made it seem like a hidden paradise. Wood-paneled, remote, perched above a small lake with a wooden dock and a fire pit outside. Sounded perfect. At least that's what I had told myself. The road narrowed the further I went, the gravel crunching under my tires, the trees crowding closer on both sides. Occasionally, a fallen branch or a large rock forced me to slow, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Something about that road already felt wrong. The air smelled damp, like soil and decaying leaves, with a faint sharpness from the evergreens. There were no houses, no other cars, no signs of life. Just the road winding deeper into the forest, and me wondering if maybe I had bitten off more isolation than I could handle. I reached the clearing that the cabin was in just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains. The cabin was exactly like the photos, more beautiful than I imagined. Weathered wood walls, a small porch with a rocking chair, a stack of firewood neatly piled by the side, and windows reflecting the still water of the lake. I parked and got out, stretching and letting the cool air wash over me. The smell of pine was strong here, and for a moment, I felt a thrill at being completely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, water, and the soft chirping of distant birds. The inside of the cabin was rustic but cozy. Hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, and an old rug that covered most of the living area. A small kitchen with basic appliances, a bedroom with a large bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. Nothing fancy, nothing modern beyond the basics, and that was exactly why I had picked it. I wanted to feel disconnected from the world, from phones, from deadlines. I unpacked slowly, putting my clothes in drawers, setting my laptop on the counter, though I had promised myself I wouldn't touch it. I brewed some coffee in the small coffee maker and stood at the window, looking out at the lake as the sun continued to sink behind the mountains. The water was darkening, reflecting the deepening sky, and for a moment, I felt a peaceful calm settle over me. I decided to take a walk before it got dark. The trail leading from the cabin was overgrown in places, roots twisting underfoot, and pine needles covering the soil in a thick carpet that muted my steps. Birds were settling in, and I could hear the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Deer, maybe, or squirrels. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, until the only sound was my own breathing and the distant lapping of water against the lake. It was serene, but there was also a subtle tension in the air, the kind that comes from being far from anyone else, with no way to call for help if something went wrong. By the time I returned, the sky had darkened into deep blue and gray streaks, and I fumbled with the flashlight I had packed, trying to find the path back to the cabin. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow across the clearing, but the surrounding trees were solid black masses against the sky. I felt a flicker of unease, the same flicker that had begun on the drive-in, a sense that the woods were watching, that the isolation was more absolute than I had expected. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, sitting at the small table, and tried to push the anxiety away. I told myself it was just the quiet, just the unfamiliarity, that I would feel better after a night of sleep. I stacked some wood in the fireplace, lit a small fire, and listened to the soft crackle and pop of the flames. It was comforting, and the warm light pushed the shadows from the corners of the room. But even as I watched, I noticed subtle things. The creak of the floorboards above me, the groan of the cabin settling into the earth, the wind rattling the thin window panes. All normal, all explainable, but each sound made me more aware of the solitude. I went to bed early, hoping to shake the nervousness, but sleep came fitfully. Every slight noise made me stir, my heart racing. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a soft sound outside the cabin. I lay very still, listening. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like something dragging across the gravel near the porch. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? A bear, maybe, or a raccoon? I had read that wildlife could be curious and bold in areas like this. I debated whether to get up and look, but the cabin door was locked, and I reasoned it was probably nothing. The next day, I tried to distract myself by exploring the area. The cabin had a small dock, and I spent hours walking along the shore, examining the water, skipping stones, and photographing the forest. I collected some firewood for the fireplace and stacked it neatly. The sun was high, the air crisp but not cold, and it should have been a perfect day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whenever I walked through the trees, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. Small things began to feel off. Footprints in the dirt that I didn't remember making, branches broken in places I didn't go. I tried to rationalize it. Deer, other hikers, my own imagination. By evening, the nervousness had escalated. I made another fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and tried to immerse myself in a book. But my mind wandered to the sounds outside. The wind had picked up, rustling branches, but there were also faint thumps, irregular, heavy, that didn't match the sound of anything I could identify. I told myself to calm down, that the cabin was safe, that I had locks on the doors and windows. But I couldn't sleep again. Every noise in the night was magnified. An owl's distant call, a branch snapping, gravel shifting under unseen feet. On the third day, I decided to go further into the woods to occupy my mind. The trail led up a small hill, steep in places, with roots and stones underfoot. As I climbed, I noticed more signs that I was not alone. Footprints in the mud, a discarded water bottle, the remnants of a small campfire. Someone had been here recently. I felt a chill. This was supposed to be a secluded cabin. I considered turning back, but curiosity drove me onward. The deeper I went, the more I noticed things. Broken branches at eye level, as if someone had been watching, and faint noises in the underbrush that stopped when I froze. I felt hunted, though there was no one there when I looked. Returning to the cabin that evening, I decided to secure everything. I checked the locks, drew the curtains, stacked extra firewood near the door for protection, and kept the flashlight at hand. The wind had picked up, howling through the pines, and the lake was a dark, choppy reflection of the night sky. I set up my phone near the bed, though service was weak, so that I could call for help if needed. The night passed with restless sleep, broken by the same noises outside. The thumps, the dragging, the occasional whisper of movement. I stayed awake for long stretches, staring into the dark, trying to convince myself it was just wildlife. By the fourth day, I realized I had been tense for almost the entire trip, the isolation wearing on me in a way I had not anticipated. I tried to focus on small tasks, cleaning the cabin, chopping more firewood, cooking, walking along the lake. But every step in the woods reminded me that I was alone, and yet not entirely alone. It was late afternoon on the fifth day when the encounter happened. I had gone for a walk down the old logging trail farther than before. The trail was overgrown, narrow, and quiet, and I felt a persistent sensation of being followed. When I stopped, the silence pressed in. I scanned the trees, the brush, the trail behind me. That's when I saw it. A figure moving just at the edge of my vision, ducking behind a tree, or so I thought. My pulse spiked. I considered running back to the cabin, but I had no way of knowing how close this person might be. My rational mind said it could be a hiker or someone camping illegally, but the part of me that feared the unknown insisted it could be dangerous. I carefully backed up along the trail, keeping my eyes on the shadows. The figure did not reappear, but I heard footsteps behind me, irregular, soft, careful. My body tensed, my mind racing with possibilities, planning escape routes in case it followed me to the cabin. I finally reached a point where the trail opened up to a small clearing, and I ran, not fast, but steadily, keeping my eyes on the forest behind me. The sounds faded as I reached the cabin, breathless, my hands shaking. Once inside, I bolted the doors, pushed furniture against the windows, and sat near the fireplace with my phone, trying to call for help. Reception was still weak, but I managed to send a text to a friend with my location and a brief note. Something is here. Don't know what. I need help. I sat awake all night, fire burning, listening to every sound, flashlight in hand. I remember the first time I saw the cabin, tucked deep into the corner of a valley that most maps barely marked. The drive-in had been long, more winding than I expected, with dirt roads that had suddenly turned into gravel and then into nothing but narrow tracks through thick pine trees. The air had been sharp and cold, and there was a smell of wet earth and decay that clung to everything. I had parked the car at the edge of a small clearing, staring at the cabin as it sat quietly among the trees. Its wood was weathered gray, the roof sagging slightly, and the windows were darkened with dirt. From the outside, it looked abandoned, yet intact, like it was waiting for someone to stumble upon it. I had decided to spend the weekend there alone, thinking it would be a simple escape from the constant noise of the city and the obligations of work. My backpack was full of supplies: food, water, blankets, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. I had also packed a little wood for the fireplace inside, although I wasn't sure if I would need it on that unusually warm late autumn weekend. The first night, as I set up my small sleeping area near the fireplace, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. The silence was unlike anything I had known. Not the comforting quiet of a suburban home or even the faint hum of a car on a distant road, but a total, absolute quiet punctuated by the occasional creak of a tree or the distant call of a bird. I told myself it was peaceful, but a part of me kept thinking about how easily someone or something could hide in those woods and go unnoticed. I spent the first day exploring the immediate surroundings. The trees were tall and tightly packed, with thick undergrowth making it nearly impossible to see more than a few meters in any direction. There was a small stream nearby which had a narrow footpath along its edge, and I followed it a little, testing the ground for stability and noting landmarks. The valley was almost completely enclosed by low mountains, and I realized there were very few ways out. One mistake or slip could leave me lost, and the thought made the back of my neck tingle. By evening, I had collected some small logs and kindling to build a fire, and as darkness fell, the cabin felt both safer and strangely oppressive. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting shadows across the walls, and I sat on the cold wooden floor trying to read a map by its light. The wind picked up, rustling the trees outside and making the cabin groan in response. It was a sound I would grow to dread over the next few days. The second day, I decided to go further into the woods, following the stream upstream. The ground was damp and uneven, and the deeper I went, the more I noticed signs of wildlife. Claw marks on trees, broken branches, footprints that looked too large to be human, and scat that suggested a deer or perhaps a larger predator had passed through recently. I was careful to note these signs, feeling a thrill of alertness mixed with fear. At one point, I heard something snap in the underbrush, just out of view, and I froze. My mind immediately jumped to bears, wolves, or perhaps something else that I couldn't see. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Whatever it was moved away, and the sound faded into the distance. My heart was racing by the time I returned to the cabin. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind outside seemed stronger, and I thought I could hear branches scratching against the roof. At one point, I felt a sudden thump, almost like someone had thrown something against the cabin walls. I convinced myself it was a loose branch, but I checked every window and door anyway, moving slowly and quietly through the small space. The floor creaked under my weight, making each movement sound louder than it was. Eventually, I managed to get back into my sleeping area and forced myself to sleep, but every time I woke, my heart was racing as the cabin settled around me. On the third day, I planned to explore a ridge I had seen from the top of a hill nearby. I left early, carrying just enough supplies for a short hike. The climb was steeper than I expected, with loose rocks and fallen leaves making the path treacherous. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, and the wind bit at my hands and face. When I finally reached the ridge, the view was breathtaking. I could see the valley below, the cabin small and dark in the middle of the forest, and the mountains stretching in every direction. But even as I admired the view, I noticed something strange. The tracks I had left in the mud on the lower path were gone. The earth was undisturbed, as if no one had walked there at all. I felt a sudden unease and quickly made my way back down, trying to tell myself it was natural. Rain, wind, animals. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That evening, back in the cabin, I began to notice small signs that made me more anxious. A log that I had set carefully by the fireplace was slightly moved, and my backpack seemed to have shifted position while I was gone. I hadn't touched anything, and yet the evidence was there. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked, and I moved all of my supplies into a corner where I could see them. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been an animal that got inside somehow? The cabin seemed too sturdy for that. Or was someone else in the woods? The thought made me uneasy enough that I sat awake most of the night, listening to every small sound. hearing the wind in the trees and the creaks of the old wood, and wondering if anyone or anything was out there. The fourth day was when things started to become truly frightening. I woke to find footprints outside the cabin, large and unmistakably human, leading from the treeline to my front door. They were fresh, and the soil was soft enough that I could see every tread. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been out there had come very close while I slept. I checked the cabin thoroughly, inspecting windows, the back door, and even the chimney flue for signs of entry. Nothing was disturbed inside, but the prints made it clear. Someone had been near, possibly watching. I decided to stay inside the cabin the rest of the day, feeling a growing panic. I didn't want to leave or move unnecessarily, but I had to keep an eye on the windows and doors. I rearranged my backpack and supplies so I could reach them quickly if I had to leave in a hurry. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful at first was now suffocating, and every sound outside, the cracking of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I realized that the forest was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a participant in my fear, a space where someone could hide and watch without me ever knowing. I spent hours looking for anything unusual in the surrounding woods, but I saw nothing beyond the normal wildlife. Still, the prints had convinced me that I wasn't alone. I considered leaving, but the path out was long, and the thought of walking through those dense woods with someone watching terrified me. I decided I would wait until morning when I could make the drive back to safety. That night, sleep was impossible. I stayed alert, moving my firewood closer to the door and keeping the flashlight in my hand. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified. My mind was in overdrive, imagining intruders, predators, accidents, everything that could go wrong. The fifth day, as dawn began to lighten the forest, I made a decision. I would leave at first light, taking the safest route I could remember. I packed quickly, double-checking that I had everything: food, water, blankets, and of course my backpack. The cabin was silent except for the occasional bird and the rustling of trees. I stepped outside and immediately noticed more footprints around the perimeter. They were everywhere now, some leading deeper into the woods, some toward the road. I didn't wait to analyze them. I moved briskly toward the car, my eyes scanning constantly for movement. The drive back down the winding gravel roads was tense. Every turn, I expected to see someone or something emerge from the trees. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I kept reminding myself to focus on the road. By the time I reached the main road, the sense of being watched had faded slightly, replaced by relief and exhaustion. I stopped at the first gas station to breathe, eat, and calm my racing heart. In the safety of daylight and people, the fear of the cabin and the surrounding forest started to feel like a distant nightmare. I realized that the real danger wasn't in the cabin itself, or in the forest's wildlife, but in the unknown presence that had been there. Someone had come close, possibly stayed nearby for hours or days, and there was no way to know why or what their intentions were. The idea of isolation had been alluring at first, but now it felt like a trap. I knew I had narrowly avoided something far worse than I had imagined. I returned home later that day, locking the doors behind me, grateful for the familiar sights and sounds of the city. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I learned that others had reported a similar experience in that valley. Strange people lurking near cabins, footprints appearing without explanation, glimpses of someone watching from the trees. The valley had a reputation, though few spoke openly about it. For me, it became a lesson in respect for isolation and caution, in understanding that nature alone can be dangerous, but humans watching silently are. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the constant noise, the traffic, and the endless emails, had grown into a kind of obsession over the last few months. Work had been unbearable, not in the sense of physical exhaustion, but mentally draining. Each day seemed to pull a little more out of me until I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the middle of my chest and replaced it with weightless emptiness. I wasn't necessarily depressed, but I was worn down, drained, and I needed something that would make me feel alive again. A cabin in the woods, far from cell signals, far from other people, sounded perfect. I didn't want adventure or excitement. I wanted silence, routine, and a chance to just exist without being bombarded by the constant demands of life. I found the cabin online. It wasn't fancy. It was small, made of weathered logs, with a tin roof that had clearly seen better days, and a stone chimney that looked like it had been built decades ago. The owner had posted photos: a modest living area with a wood stove, a small kitchen with old but serviceable appliances, a bedroom with a simple double bed, and a bathroom that had, apparently, running water. The surroundings looked beautiful, the kind of dense forest that made me feel small but also safe, like I was enclosed in a giant, protective green hug. I rented it for a week, promising myself I would go there alone, with just my backpack, a small supply of groceries, and a bag of firewood. I drove up the winding dirt road late in the afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees, making the forest look even more dense than it appeared in photos. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a smell that instantly made me feel calmer. My car rattled along the uneven path, and I had to slow down frequently because of fallen branches, loose rocks, and small depressions in the dirt. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had almost completely disappeared, leaving only a faint golden glow above the horizon. I parked and stepped out, immediately noticing the silence. No birds, no insects, just a quiet that felt heavy, like it was pressing against my ears. I didn't mind. I had expected this. The cabin itself was exactly as it had appeared online, maybe even smaller than I had imagined. The logs were rough, the wood creaking slightly as I stepped onto the porch. The door opened without resistance, and I stepped inside, feeling the immediate shift from the cold, fading light outside to the warmer, if musty, interior. I dropped my backpack by the door and ran my hands over the surfaces. Dust coated some areas, and cobwebs hung from corners, but it felt real, authentic, like I was stepping into a place that had been lived in and then abandoned, waiting for someone to care again. I spent the first hour just exploring. The living area had a fireplace with a stack of kindling nearby. The sofa was worn but usable, and the windows looked out over the trees, which swayed slightly in the evening breeze. The kitchen was minimal but functional. The sink had water, the stove worked, and there was even an old kettle that looked like it had been used many times before. The bedroom was small but comfortable enough, with a bed that smelled faintly of cedar and old blankets. I made a quick meal on the stove, eating in silence while watching the shadows outside stretch across the forest. The light faded entirely, leaving the woods dark and almost impenetrable. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to wake up with the sunrise to experience the forest in the quietest hours. I slept in a fitful way that first night. The creaking of the cabin was louder than I expected. Each gust of wind made the tin roof thrum and rattle. Every small sound outside, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me sit up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. I had told myself I was prepared for this, that it was normal for a cabin in the woods to make noises. But lying there alone, in the pitch black, the isolation felt more intense than I had imagined. I didn't fall asleep until the hours had passed, and when I did, it was a light sleep, filled with half-waking moments where I could hear every shift in the forest. Morning brought relief. The sun rose slowly, painting the treetops with gold and illuminating the mist that hung low between the trunks. I brewed coffee on the stove, sitting by the window and taking in the view. Everything felt clean and still, and the tension from the night seemed to wash away. I spent the morning exploring the area around the cabin, walking along a narrow path that led into the woods. Birds were starting to chirp, small insects buzzed, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I felt a simple joy, the kind that comes from being completely removed from the normal pressures of life. The day passed quietly. I chopped some firewood, prepared another small meal, and settled in for an evening by the fireplace. By the second day, I began to notice small details I hadn't before. The way the wind pushed through the trees, causing shadows to shift across the cabin walls. The sound of distant water, probably a creek or small stream nearby, the subtle movements of animals in the undergrowth, which I could see if I stared long enough out the windows. There was a rhythm here, a slow pulse to life that I didn't recognize in the city. It was mesmerizing and, in a strange way, comforting. I felt a connection to the place, as if it had existed forever, indifferent to my presence, but willing to let me be part of it temporarily. The third night was when the unease started. It wasn't a clear event at first, just a feeling. A small tightening in my chest that I tried to ignore. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. The wind had died, and even the animals were absent. I sat by the window, trying to focus on the comforting details I had noticed earlier, but the darkness outside seemed different, heavier, denser. When I went to bed, the creaking of the cabin no longer sounded like ordinary settling noises. Each one felt deliberate, as if the cabin itself was adjusting to something I couldn't perceive. The silence pressed in on me from every side. Around midnight, the feeling became acute. I woke to a noise, a subtle scraping, almost imperceptible at first, coming from outside. I froze, straining my ears, heart hammering. The sound was faint, irregular, like someone or something was moving carefully among the undergrowth near the cabin. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears, deer, or even raccoons could make similar noises. But the scraping persisted, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Every time it stopped, I would convince myself it had gone, and then it would start again, closer this time, like it was inspecting the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, only shadows, but the instinctual fear grew. I stayed still, hoping it would go away, listening to my own heartbeat over the sound of the windless night. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, the first pale light revealed the source of the noise, or at least what it had been. The door to the cabin had scratch marks, shallow but clear, like claws had scraped at the wood. I hadn't locked the door, assuming it was unnecessary, but now I felt the weight of that decision. I checked the windows. One of the panes had a small chip at the corner, as if something had struck it from outside. I didn't see footprints immediately, but the ground was soft from recent rain, so impressions would have been difficult to see. I made a mental note to remain alert, to be more cautious. I spent the day repairing some of the damage as best I could. I reinforced the door with a wooden rod, wedged it securely so it couldn't easily be forced open. I inspected all windows and doors, checking locks and seals, and tried to establish some sense of security. The rest of the day was tense but uneventful. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened and shortened, and I tried to focus on mundane tasks: cooking, cleaning, stacking firewood. But the unease remained, like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. The next 2 nights were harder. Each time darkness fell, every sound became amplified. A branch falling 30 feet away sounded like it was against the cabin wall. The occasional howl of a distant animal sent jolts of fear through me. Every gust of wind through the trees made me tense. On the 4th night, I awoke to a distinct sound. Footsteps, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush around the cabin. They circled the cabin slowly, never too far, never too close, but always audible. My first instinct was to call for help, but there was no cell signal. I considered leaving the cabin, but the thought of stepping out into the dark, surrounded by trees that could hide anything, seemed more dangerous. I stayed in the bed, rigid with fear, listening, counting, and waiting until the sound finally receded in the early hours of the morning. I spent the following day preparing. I reinforced all possible entry points. I piled logs against windows from the inside, moved heavy furniture in front of doors, and even carved makeshift stakes from wood to use as weapons if necessary. The tension had